Good afternoon, everybody. Okay.
Good afternoon, sir.
Yeah. Please, no need to not need to speak. You can just put a chat message. Thank you, Sonsi. Yeah. Okay, just let me check our the important guests have entered or not, huh? And then we are starting with our event. Yeah.
Hello. Good morning, everybody. Good morning, sir. Very good morning, sir. Very good morning. Very good morning. Good morning, sir.
Hello, everybody. May I request the students of Department of English or the local members, if you are logged in, then please log out for a while so that our chief guests and vice chancellors can enter. The room is full, so they are not able to enter. So I would request the students of our department or the people from Bhavnagar University, if you have logged in, just log out for a while. Watch it on Facebook or YouTube and let the guests enter. Yeah, we already have 250 plus people here, and request the department students and the local Bhavnagar people to log out from the classroom for a while so that we can give an entry to our guests, our Honorable Vice Chancellor, sir. Everybody also suggested, again, reminder I give you that put your mic off. Don't present. If you see the screen, then press stop presenting. Yes, again, there are already 250. I would request some of the local people to log out from the meeting room and watch it live on YouTube or Facebook. Hello, sir. અચ્છા હજી 250 હું કહું છું અમુક લોકોને નીકળવા માટે નો તમે પેલા વીસી ના આઈડી માંથી કરો છો કે તમારા પોતાનામાંથી? હા એટલે એમાં VC@MKBU માંથી લોગિન થયા છો કે તમારું પોતાનું છે? તમારા નામથી આઈડી છે? મેં તો બંનેમાં મોકલી હતી લગભગ વીસી ઉપર તો મોકલી હતી જ તમે એટલે એમાંથી એન્ટર થશો તો લગભગ ડિરેક્ટલી મળી જશે એન્ટ્રી. હા હા તો એમાં આમાં હા આમાં આપો ને. અચ્છા હા હા ઓકે. A very good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Again, the first session was very interesting. Some 10 participants presented their papers in that session. We are in this inauguration and the first plenary sessions now. We cordially welcome in this session our Honourable Vice Chancellor Dr. Mahipatsinh Chavda sir. Our guest of this session is Vice Chancellor of Junagadh University, Dr. Chetan Trivedi sir. We also warmly welcome you in this one. In this plenary talk, we have 4 speakers. Dr. Atanu Bhattacharya sir is from Central University of Gujarat, Gandhinagar. Second speaker will be Kamalakar Bhat from Maharashtra. Third speaker will be Kalyan Chattopadhyay from West Bengal, Kolkata. And fourth will be Avishek Parui from IIT Madras. I warmly welcome all the 4 speakers also in this session there. Just a brief feed about this webinar conference. We have received more than 1,300 registrations in this event. We have received more than 150 abstracts for the presentations. We were not able to include all the abstracts, so we have selected 80 papers, and in various sessions, the 80 participants are going to present their papers. Apart from that, we have 3 plenary sessions and 12 experts, eminent speakers, are going to express their views about literature and epidemics here. In this session, we will have 4 speakers speaking about the same thing. We have participation from all over India. Almost all the states and union territories are represented in the participation. We have plenary speakers also from so many states here. This in a truly true sense, this is a kind of a national webinar where nooks and corner of India are getting represented here. So first of all, I would request Dr. Atanu Bhattacharya to make a brief presentation about and his views about literature and epidemics. Dr. Atanu Bhattacharya. Yes, Dr. Atanu Bhattacharya, sir. You have to unmute
Yes,
your
mic.
yeah, okay, fine. Yeah,
Can you hear me now? Am I audible?
Yeah, yes, we are. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So I'll just share my presentation. I've got a PowerPoint. I'll just take
Okay.
1 minute here.
Yeah, okay, fine, please. Yeah. Keep your video also on so your face is visible along with your presentation.
Can you see me? I have kept my
Yeah,
video.
it's going on well. Please continue. Yeah, please.
Yeah, all right. So first of all, thank you very much, Bhavnagar University and the esteemed guests who have joined this webinar, especially Professor Dilip Bharat from the Department of English for inviting me in these challenging times and inviting me especially in this webinar on literature and epidemics. As you can see, the topic of my presentation is imagining disaster, texts and contexts. And what I am planning to do as a part of this is that I'm going to look at disaster in general. So I've chosen the word disaster over other related words. I knew that the webinar is on specifically pandemics, but I've chosen the word disaster over other related words like disease or pandemic or epidemic. Since I think the word captures the basic imagination of such actual occurrences or events. So disaster is being used during the presentation as a kind of an umbrella term, which also includes, of course, pandemics, epidemics, and diseases. However, during the course of my presentation, what I intend to do, and I want to keep it in mind of the audience as well as keep it in my mind while making the presentation, is that I'll try to restrict myself to use the word within its limited meanings of disease and pandemic. So I'm going to use the word disaster most of the times, but I'm going to also use it with a very specific focus on diseases and pandemics. So moving on to what very quickly I would like to go through and what my plan today is that I would like to start with how do we imagine disaster, especially how do we imagine disaster in our literary imaginations. And I would like to draw on Susan Sontag's ideas on disaster and how it is imagined in popular culture. And we'll come in the next slide as we'll see how Sontag defines disaster, especially within popular forms or popular literary genres. We'll also try to conduct a very quick genealogy of imagining disaster in Europe, especially with reference to the plague, because that seems to be the most common imaginary in Europe about a pandemic or an epidemic. We'll try to do a similar quick genealogy in the context of Bengal, which, since that's a context that I understand, and though I would have probably written that in the context of India, because we have mentioned Europe before that, but it's a context of Bengal that we are going to focus on. And we're going to look at how the pandemic becomes a representative form in Bengal at a certain point of time. And finally, we will draw some common strands for understanding the complex network of relationships that literature and pandemic or epidemic has in its representative context. So we'll also look at possibilities of exploring such ideas in the field of research. So this is the general outline, the general plan that I have today in the time that I have been given. Now, I would like to read this out very quickly. This is Susan Sontag at the beginning of her very famous essay called The Imagination of Disaster, which she wrote in 1965. And she said that ours is indeed an age of extremity, for we live under continual threat of two equally fearful but seemingly opposed destinies, unremitting banality and inconceivable terror. It is fantasy served out in large rations by the popular arts, which allows most people to cope with these twin specters. For one job that fantasy can do is to lift us out of the unbearably humdrum and to distract us from terrors, real or anticipated, by an escape into exotic dangerous situations which have last-minute happy endings. But another one of the things that fantasy can do is to normalize what is psychologically unbearable, thereby inuring us to it. In the one case, fantasy beautifies the world. In the other, it neutralizes it. Now, as mentioned in the outline, as we have seen in the previous slide, It would be worthwhile starting with Sontag, since she's one that conceptualized disaster as a possible imaginary. Though Sontag's idea of disaster was confined to the popular, especially in this essay, what she was looking at was basically popular science fiction films that were flooding American markets in the 1950s and the 1960s. And this was a curious time in America. It was a time of extremities because America itself was poised at the cusp of being a post-World War leader. And at the same time, it was kind of imagining the terror of a nuclear holocaust with reference to the communist bloc, because you already had the Iron Curtain and the communist bloc and the Cold War had begun. So there was this specter of nuclear holocaust. But I still feel that though it was what Sontag was doing in terms of science fiction films at this particular point of time in 1950s and 60s is still kind of worth pursuing even today with reference to the pandemic that we face today. And Sontag's idea of this possibility of aesthetic beauty and taming terror, or fantastic imagination, the possibility of neutralization, and the repetitiveness of everyday life and the unthinkable fear. So all these two opposites that kind of come together in most of these representations, whether literary, they're almost a kind of an oxymoronic existence that brings two opposites together, almost like an aporia, an unsolvable paradox. And it is interesting that even representations that we look at in the next few slides, when we look at the representations that has governed the history of representations and pandemics or disasters, it kind of follows this strange tension between this aesthetic beauty, but at the same time, this immense amount of fear that this beauty also generates. And therefore, probably important for the context that we are going to deal with today. So it kind of provides us with a working framework to understand how a network of texts encounter and negotiate a network of contexts. So as a part of looking at this network, what we're going to do is, and taking off from Sontag, we'll try to do a quick genealogy of the imaginary of disaster in Europe. And the painting that you see on the screen is a painting by Titian, called the Pieta, not the Michelangelo Pieta, of course. And this was done around 1576. And as you can see in the painting, it is the painter himself in the red cloak who is actually praying to Mary and Jesus to save him and, of course, his son in the painting. And this was painted exactly in the year when Venice was plagued with, was attacked by the bubonic plague, and millions of people were dying. So the bubonic plague, or the Black Death as it is popularly called, had been a part of the Western imagination for a very, very long time. While earlier manifestations of such imaginary and representations often took the form of a very Christian, as we can see over here, a very Christian piety or a lack thereof. So sometimes they were angry representations where God has abandoned people. The plague was always kind of seen as God's curse or retribution for humanity's sins, or simply an unexplained mystery of the God's world, as seen in this painting by Titian, where the painter is making a desperate plea to God to save him and his child. So you have a sense of piety, but there is also a sense of desolation. As you can see, the tones are extremely subdued. It is darkly lit. It doesn't look like a church. It looks like a sepulchre almost. It looks like a graveyard, etc. So the general quality of the so-called Renaissance paintings are missing. But we have this sense of piety as well. So we have an interesting shift once these kind of paintings emerged, and plague became a part of the popular imagination and a lived reality across the 16th, 17th, and 18th century. Remember, Europe was haunted by the plague for more than 3-4 centuries. So if we take a kind of a jump, a historical jump, and we come to another painting by Salvatore Russa called Humana Fragilitas, the human frailty, which was painted about 80 years later in 1656. And if you look at this painting very carefully, then by 1656, almost barely 18 years after Titian's fervent plea to God to save him and his child, incidentally, Titian and his son. Incidentally, Titian and his son both died in the year 1576 when Pieta was painted. Salvatore Russa, as you can see, has taken already a leap. The plague is still terrifying and still kills millions of people. In Rosa's case, and Rosa was a painter in Naples, and it killed millions in the year actually 1656. And yet we notice a kind of a distinct shift in what is happening in this painting. So what you see over a period of 80 years, the relationship between the pandemic and arts has changed. So death, though the epidemic or the plague is now seen, it's now seen more as a social contract, a fact that everyone has to live through, including a child who has to sign this contract with death. So if you look at the painting carefully, it's actually a child with a mother who is signing a kind of a contract with death. And you can link this contractual representation as a shift from divine intervention or abject surrender to divinity, as seen in the previous painting in Titian, to some sense of human agency. Now, this one can question what this human agency is. It is extremely feeble. It is doomed because the child is going to die finally. But you do have a sense of an agency over here. And since it can be located here and can be traced to the idea of contract itself. So the idea of the contract is an interesting one that happens within a space of 80 years. Because you can actually now trace the contract back, the idea of the contract back to, for example, Hobbes, who wrote this famous text called Leviathan, where he came up with this idea of the social contract between the citizen and the king. So the idea of the contract between an individual having agency and the state or the government to have a social contract is already floating around, and the painting kind of captures that. So the divinity part is now removed, and there is a shift from Titian to Rosa now. But before we go on to the other aspects of plague, and we can keep on going, keep on talking about it, we must, of course, not forget Shakespeare, because we are in an English department, and I guess that it is important to kind of remember him. So people have often wondered why the plague did not find much mention in Shakespeare at all, though he must have lived through one of the most dangerous times in England, when the plague ravaged towns and cities across the country. So you had massive plague outbreaks in England when Shakespeare was writing. Now, it is not that Shakespeare does not deal with plague at all, and we can often find the presence of an undertone of the epidemic in short passages or conversations in quite a few of his plays. For example, in Twelfth Night, Olivia, in one of her speeches, when she finds out that she is falling in love, she actually compares her love to a plague. And she says that this is something that I need to live with. So you have started now saying that you have to live with the plague. You really are not afraid of it, or you are not going to have a contractual relation with it, but it is something that is existent that you have to live with now. Now, it is this particular passage that I have put up on the screen that is of interest to us over here, because this dialogue is voiced by Ross. He's a very minor character in the play. And he's trying to describe the land ruled by Macbeth. So Ross is asked by Duncan, who is going to become the king, that how does the land look under Macbeth's rule? And this is what he says. We know that the land is being ruled by Macbeth, who, of course, if you have read the play, and I'm sure that many of you have, he has killed the king, and he has butchered a large number of people in his domain. The description, and this quotation is taken from one of Greenblatt's essay. So the description that you have over here is almost lifted out of description of a plague. So the country is almost affected by a plague. In fact, the play was possibly performed just 2 years after London was ravaged by an outbreak in 1604. So Macbeth was performed in 1606, and you had a massive plague outbreak in 1604. The memory of that outbreak is still there in this passage, and you can still see it. However, Shakespeare now gives it a more human agency. So it is now no more God's retribution. It is the madness of a blood-crazed dictator that has brought the plague. Shakespeare almost shifts the focus from the divine to the more human domain of tyranny, where the plague is removed from the network of divinity and placed within the messy network of monarchy, dictatorship, and politics. So now there's been a further shift in the representation of the plague. This then takes us very quickly, we are taking a huge historical jump to a disaster and how it has been especially imagined in the modern times. And we have to take a leap because we are running out of time. So I'll just very quickly go through this slide, and we must see that the modern encounters the plague in a very different way. Though we can still completely trace the genealogy of the plague in, for example, Defoe's Journal of the Plague, which was written in the 18th century, or Charles Baudelaire's Scanning of the Diseased City, where he looks at Paris through the eyes of the plague, etc. But I'm going to leave that out, and we're going to come straight to the modern times, to the classic of modern classic of Camus, where he encounters the plague in 1947. Ingmar Bergman's film The Seventh Seal, 1957, and of course the more recent representations of diseases or epidemics in films like Contagion or World War Z. Now what we have here is quite obvious, where the imagination of disaster becomes much more existential, located within the angst of a modern society. So especially in the first two, in Camus and in Bergman, it is much more an existential problem now, and there's been a massive shift in this understanding of the plague. While Camus details this existential crisis in this major shift, Bergman's film The Seventh Seal produces the plague as another post-World War existential crisis, a game of dare. So the actual protagonist of the film dares death, a game of dare and chess with death itself. Now, more modern representations of films like Contagion or World War Z now has contained the possibility of disaster within the techno-medical world of science, where everything can now be translated into a solvable scientific equivalent that can then be consumed within the visual media. So what you have in these films is this possibility of scientific revolution or scientific containment of the epidemic. This possibly is another shift that can be explored, how the imagination of disaster in the modern world is almost always negotiated with the technological imaginary. So we always negotiate what we see as a pandemic or an epidemic that can be contained by technology, by science, by an encounter with science and technology. We'll take a very quick, almost geographical leap now, because I'm coming to Bengal. And the image that you see on screen is actually the image of someone called Shitala Mata, who is worshipped in Bengal for almost 200, 300 years odd. And let me just very quickly go through how disaster is imagined within the world of literary imagination, especially in India, and I'm focusing on Bengal, though this might be seen in different contexts in India in general. Now, I'll try to provide a broad brushstroke, or generally broad brushstrokes here in the context of Bengal. And one of the traditions that Bengal has for a very long time is the tradition of the Mangal Kavya. We are not going to go into great details about what the Mangal Kavya is, but the form itself is a very curious mix of folk stories, folk tales, and the more formal Puranic traditions of storytelling, Sanskritic traditions of storytelling. So one of the earliest stories that emerged out of this tradition is the story of Shitala Mata, the goddess of smallpox in Bengal. And the name itself, as you can see, indicates that she is the goddess of coldness, so she is Shital. Though across India, there are variations how she is worshipped as the protector against diseases, protector of children, etc., etc. She, in a sense, is the goddess of epidemics, and Shitala Mangal, the Mangal Kavya that was written, is the literary representation of this goddess, produced around 17th, 18th century. Thus, while the protecting goddess for epidemics has long been a part of the folk tradition, if we come to more formal literary traditions in Bengal, so this has been a part of folk traditions in Bengal for a very long time. I can give you a large number of examples in Mangal Kavya tradition itself. For example, Manasa Mangal, who is the goddess of snakes, etc. So if you come to more formal forms of literary representations like the novel, etc., in the 18th and 19th century, it is more about the effects of the disaster than the disaster itself that holds sway. So when you move from the folk to the more formal literary traditions, you have another shift, especially in Bengal. And what I'm going to tell you very quickly is that the modern Bengali imagination over here, as you can see in these 4 texts that I have put up on the screen, Bhavani Bhattacharya's 1947 text, So Many Hungers, Ganodevata, which is the next one by Tarashankar Bandyopadhyay, written in 1943. Satyajit Ray's Distant Thunder, which was a film that was based on a Vibhushan Bandyopadhyay book. which was made in 1972, and Navanna, Valiur Bhattacharya's famous play on the Bengal famine. So if you look at these four texts, the modern Bengali imagination seems to be, or imaginary if you call it so, is almost haunted by the series of famines that hit Bengal since the mid-18th century. And the most devastating famine all of us know was in 1943. So people aware of its history would also be aware that this was a purely human-induced famine that ravaged the city and the countryside, leading to millions of deaths through hunger and disease. Tarashankar's Ganodevata, the second text, Bhavani Bhattacharya's So Many Hungers, Ray's Ashoni Sanket. So the Satyajit Ray film in Bengali is called Ashoni Sanket, Distant Thunder. And Valiur Bhattacharya's Navanna, they kind of form a network of texts across media forms responding to this disaster of hunger. So here disaster is seen more as hunger rather than an actual epidemic or pandemic. In its modern version, thus, the imagination of disaster in Bengal has been negotiated through a slightly different prism than what we have seen in Europe. It is not seen so much as the disaster that produces an existential crisis. The focus is always in these Bengali texts seems to be on the actual material practices that the disaster produces. So what does the disaster do in terms of material practices, in terms of material changes? That is what the focus of the modern Bengali text is. And it is the materiality of hunger that, for example, in Ashoni Sanket, the materiality of hunger is very much there. This then finally takes us to the to conclude my presentation, to the conclusion. So what do we draw from these? So what can we take away basically from this discussion? So the first thing is that the imagination of disaster that produces an aesthetic response is itself negotiated through the particular network of context and text within which it is produced. It would be perhaps worthwhile as researchers or as interested scholars to trace such genealogies, not only through the written, but also through the visual field. Corollary to this would perhaps be to understand the nature of the popular that negotiates such disasters. So what we have seen throughout the presentation is that how the popular kind of responds to a pandemic or to a disease or to a disaster. So what I'm going to do is, talking of the popular, I would like to leave you with this image, which is drawn by Bhaskar Chitrakar, a contemporary Kalighat Patachitrakar, Kalighat painting. People who will be aware of Kalighat painting. And Bhaskar Chitrakar is probably the last in the line in the tradition of Kalighat paintings that started in the 19th century in Bengal. And what he has done is he has taken the form of the painting, but of course he has contemporaneized it in the form of the COVID-19 situation that we face today as a popular imaginary in the times of the pandemic. And with this, I thank you for listening to me and hope all of you stay safe. And I'm looking forward to the discussions and the questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Atanu Bhattacharya, sir, to be very pointed and brief. Thank you. Thanks a lot. We are moving towards the second presenter, our plenary speaker, that is Dr. Kamalakar Bhat. May I request Dr. Kamalakar Bhat to unmute your sound? And
Yes,
also,
I have.
yeah, okay. Yeah, okay, you are visible now. And sir, yeah, please, you can start your presentation. Yeah. Okay, sir.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Bharat. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Dr. Kamalakar Bhat from Ahmednagar, Maharashtra. Let me first of all thank Dr. Atanu Chakravarti for his erudite and excellent presentation. Let me also thank the MK Bhavanagar University and its English department, especially the very innovative and active Professor Dr. Dilip Barad, for bringing us together on this platform and facilitating this exchange of ideas. Because I believe that grave times are in fact the right times for serious reflection. And we today are facing a very grave situation, which those who can will help us to overcome, though our job as students of humanities is to probe how we can extend the boundaries of understanding the present crisis. Hence, this webinar on literature and epidemics is really very relevant. Therefore, I'm grateful to MK Bhavnagar University and Professor Bharat for putting this together. In my submission today on what I have called pandemics and revisions of society, I want to argue that literature of epidemics is literature that revisions society, which are about revising society. I want to do three things in this presentation. First, I want to discuss how literature responds to epidemics. Secondly, I want to comment on the connections between literature about epidemics and reimagining societies. Thirdly, I will flesh out this discussion through some comments on a specific literary text, your Anantamurthy's 1965 novel, Samskara. Epidemics bring to the fore the fragility of our existence, a fragility perhaps made greater by our own choices, whether economic, hygienic, moral, or social. This fragility and the radical uncertainties it throws up are the stuff that literature addresses. Famine, flood, earthquake, and epidemics are the perennial forms of collective suffering that human beings are familiar with. Human destiny has forever been shaped and reshaped by these afflictions over which human beings have never been able to have much control. Epidemics of many kinds have featured in literature since ancient times, going as far back as Homer's epics and Greek tragedies. How do epidemics feature in literature is the question we are exploring today. Literature is not merely a mirror to the reality of epidemics. As always, it endows an additional value, a supplementary significance to the disturbing experience of a plague, a cholera, smallpox, or whatever other pestilence. Obviously, literature offers no solution to the plight we face in the times of pandemics. But literature is one of the resources from which we draw in order to have the resilience to face it and survive it. Literature contributes to creating a mindset and attitude that can deal with the aftermath of the epidemics. But it's not as if pestilence and literary expression have a simple representational connection. Far from the case. In fact, considering the frequency of the epidemics, it is the absence of the record of epidemics in so many literary works that's a wonder than the few that actually record. It's also worth noting that most of the canonical works dealing with epidemics do so, in fact, indirectly. Literature has responded to such afflictions as epidemics primarily in three ways. I'm not saying only through these three manners, but I want to describe these three ways. The same text also may have more than one mode of response. First is recording. Literature is, after all, a mnemonic device. As such, it gives us an idea of what it was like living under epidemics. Daniel Defoe's A Journal of the Plague Year, for example. Such literature gives us the historical details, the plight of people and other living beings, efforts to survive, right and wrong behavior during such times, actions of the rulers, etc. Secondly, metaphoric. The epidemic is a metaphor for something else, and the text is an elaboration or an examination of the human condition in which epidemics enact a certain symbolic probing. Here, the disease is only an external manifestation of a universal human condition. Albert Camus, whose The Plague is an example of this, says, I quote, each of us has the plague within him. No one on earth is free from it. Unquote. Thirdly, healing. Literature that responds thus aims at consoling those who are anxious while facing epidemics and providing ways of surviving it. For example, Boccaccio wrote the Decameron during a plague outbreak in Florence in 1348. His purpose was to offer some entertainment that will keep the minds of his readers of the depressing details of the affliction during the quarantine period. All epidemic literature are somehow or the other parables, I would dare to say. Realism they may have, but they are amenable to furnishing, if not foregrounding, a moral. Now, I want to turn to my second point. How literature of epidemics presents revisions of society. Epidemics are a very strange phenomenon. They create illness within wellness. That is, even those who have not contracted the virus are affected in other ways by it. Literary texts focused on epidemics have been written not only during, but also at periods when there are no epidemics. And thus, quite often, it has been deployed symbolically. It is symbolic that epidemics spread through the same channels as do affection and friendship, touch, contact, sharing. Epidemics demand that we suspend our channels of belonging, of sociality. During epidemics, we are required to practice social distancing, doubting others, viewing company as risky, contact as fatal. Epidemics instill in us a general unease with connecting with others. Empathy is the basic building block of a healthy society, and empathy needs contact, intimacy. A hug is the most intimate, empathetic message. Munna Bhai's Jadoo Ki Jabbi. It is in disallowing such contact that epidemics come to symbolize human practices of exclusion. In forming groups, we not only develop ways of connecting with each other, but also put in place ways of disconnecting from some, ways of isolating ourselves from some. In other words, formation of social bonds are at once processes of integration and othering. Epidemics parallel the latter process in as far as it drives us to practice disconnect. Epidemics is essentially a template for othering. Why do epidemics afford symbolic situations suitable for thinking about revisions of society? This is a moot question that I guess this webinar seeks to address. My sense is that literature views epidemics precisely as that evil which is already present in us. Doubt, distrust, disconnect, which are inimical to sociality. And hence, the cure to epidemics includes not only medicines to the body, but also to the body politic, society. Frank Snowden, the author of Epidemics and Society, says that, I quote, epidemics are a category of disease that seem to hold up the mirror to human beings as to who we really are. That is to say, they obviously have everything to do with our relationship to our mortality, to death, to our lives. They also reflect our relationship with the environment, the built environment and that we create, and the natural environment that responds. They show the moral relationships that we have toward each other as people, and we are seeing that today, unquote. Yes, epidemics reshape society. One simple reminder is the end of feudalism as a result of Black Death during the 14th century Europe. Okay, let me recapitulate the point I'm making here. Literature does give us graphical records of epidemics experience. Literature may also help us to take our mind off the pestilence and keep the spirits up, like the many online challenges these days do. But these apart, the metaphorical treatment of epidemics in literature is very significant. Epidemics afford a specific symbolic significance pertaining to the deficiencies in our societies. It pertains to the structures in society that, like the epidemics itself, demand exclusion and isolation. Epidemics also show us our weakest links. It is in relation to these weakest links that I wish to argue writers respond to by reimagining the society or alerting us to the need for revising or reforming the society. Literary works thus present revisions of societies. Now, let me turn to my third point. Here, I want to show how U.R. Ananthamurthy, in his novel Samskara, examines the crisis of beliefs related to sociality. Samskara is a much celebrated novel, which was also made into a film. It has been translated by A.K. Ramanujan and was published in 1976 by Oxford University Press. It's widely read as a critique of the decadent Brahminical lifestyle. In this novel, a colony of ritualistic Brahmins contracts plague through a renegade among them. The novel has very little graphical portrayal of the impact of plague, unlike such works as Jack London's The Scarlet Plague, for example. It focuses more on the crisis of values engendered by the death of this renegade character called Naranappa, whose hedonist lifestyle poses the question as to whether he deserves to be given a Brahminical last rites. The novel has been generally read within the orbit of caste question and its critical portrayal of corrupt individuals from the priestly class. I want to bracket these sociological readings for the time being and turn to the metaphorical significance of the epidemics in this novel. Here, the question I want to explore is, why does the author deploy epidemics as bringing up the crisis that the novel probes? As stated earlier, the answer is the metaphorical significance of the plague as a disease that castigates contact or touch. For U.R. Ananthamurthy, the major sign of the community's rot is in its abhorrence of touch. My argument is that though the novel presents much metaphysical ruminations on desire, asceticism, Brahminical traditions of rituals, notions of purity and impurity, and so on, it views the health of society as emanating from the habit of connecting. And that is where the novel's revision of society lies. The novel, written in 1965, set in the state of Karnataka, explores the impact of plague on an idealistic priest living among a bunch of hypocritical villagers. It sets up two characters, Praneshacharya and Naranappa, as representing conforming and confronting attitudes, respectively, towards tradition. The villagers mostly profess to follow the example of Praneshacharya, but in reality are all crass materialists and opportunists, finding pleasure in property, food, and such other surrogative indulgences. U.R. Ananthamurthy inserts plague into this confusion of values. Plague is very often seen as uncovering the fault lines in this community. Samskara has two parts. The first describes the rot, isolation based on puritanical practices of pollution, touch as a norm. This delineation indicates that the community under description is not yet a society as it is built on exclusion. This community's way of life is ritualistic, and its ideal is represented by Praneshacharya. Its rejection is represented by Naranappa, who defies all caste norms to live an indulgent life. But both the forms, extreme isolation and extreme indulgence, are shown to be dis-ease, hence not suitable for formation of sociality. If the first part is a statement of the problem, dis-ease as its symptom, problem is the inability to form a society, the second part of the novel may be seen as exploring possibilities, not solutions, of revisions. Here, the important indicator is a character called Putta, who seems to symbolize in his extrovert behavior the opposite of exclusion. Putta is ever eager to connect with others, as against othering as the norm of the community, which is shown in the first part. We now have connecting with others, exploring the possibilities of links as a value. Praneshacharya, the learned man, is subjected to revising his own worldview, even as he meditates about the beliefs he had lived by, as against the ones his opposites, Naranappa or Mahabala, had lived by. That is, Praneshacharya's new socialization is underway through Putta, a talkative, well-connected, empathetic character. Epidemics in this novel metaphorically is about the evil of a stagnant society, wallowing in exclusionary forms of life. It has pushed Praneshacharya to revisioning and facilitates experiencing through Putta the available alternative forms of life. The experience of epidemic in Sanskara, when we translate all symbolic and metaphorical content, has this to tell us: more and more inclusion, contact rather than othering, will help us to reimagine society. Today, we too face a comparable exclusion-based form of life, where in terms of resources and economy, there are great exclusions and othering. The crisis presently underway of migrant laborers and how they have been treated by the system is a case in point. But as Frank Snowden points out, pandemics teach us that what affects one person anywhere affects everyone everywhere. Precisely what Edgar Allan Poe's 1842 tale, The Mask of the Red Death, also thematizes. The pandemic is metaphorically a lesson for us to revision and revise our society of not only the humans, but all forms, to have ecological consciousness. Hamid Dabashi says something important. I quote, "Surviving this pandemic is urgent, but not efficient. Surviving it with a sense of common decency, collective reasoning, and public purpose is equally important." Unquote. The question then could be, what is the point of discussing literature in the context of the present pandemics? And what is there to learn from it? My suggestion, along with Harish Trivedi and Hamid Dabashi, is this: literature leads us not to a solution to the pandemics, but to the life that survives the pandemic. If pandemic distances us, our move should not be to internalize this and have structures in our society that institutionalize distancing. We need, in fact, to see life after pandemics as life without the pandemic dictate of distancing. We need to end othering, move toward touchable living. It's not Praneshacharya's philosophical ruminations, but Putta's intimate friendliness that is the trope of alternatives. Connect, Only connect is the message from this plague-focused novel, Sanskara. Thank you. That is my submission. If there are questions, I'm happy to respond. And I'm going to end by thanking Bharat and Bhavnagar University. And all the
Thanks a lot, Dr. Kamalakar Bhat. That was very unique way of looking at Sanskar. And thanks for your wonderful talk on literature and epidemic with the context of URN and Murthy's there. Thank you. Thanks a lot. Before we move on to the third presenter, that is Dr. Kalyan Chattopadhyay, I would like to request you all to just have a look at this screen for a while. By the time Dr. Kalyan Chattopadhyay from Kolkata gets ready for the presentation. I think you are able to see the page of the maps. Yeah? This is the map of the participants. So throughout India, we have received the participation in this webinar. We are very thankful to all the participants for your interest, also to have a faith in us and joining from all the nooks and corners of India in this webinar. You all have made it truly a national level webinar in all its context. This is the map of our plenary speakers. They are also coming from the various states of India. And we're very thankful to all these plenary speakers for sparing their time and having a very wonderful deliberations with us here. Okay? So we are going towards the third speaker, and I would request Dr. Kalyan Chattopadhyay to come on the screen. Dr. Kalyan Chattopadhyay, please unmute your mic. Also display your video. Yes, are you there, Dr. Kalyan Chattopadhyay? We just had a phone call and he was already there. After this is Dr. Avishek Parui. I would request him also to be ready in case there is a problem with Dr. Kalyan Chattopadhyay. Then we can have Dr. Avishek from IIT Madras. Dr. Kalyan, are you there? You have to unmute your mic and put on your camera so you can be visible here. Okay, then Dr. Avishek, are you there?
Hello.
Yeah, Kalyan, Dr. Kalyan, yeah, you are there. Okay, yeah. Welcome, Dr. Kalyan Chattopadhyay. You are warmly welcomed in this webinar. And please start your presentations.
Thank you. Are my slides visible now?
Yes, visible. Yeah, visible. Yeah.
Okay. So, good afternoon, everybody. I am Professor Kalyan Chattopadhyay. I basically work as an English teacher in Bankim Sardar College, which is in the south of Calcutta, and it is affiliated to the University of Calcutta. And first of all, I would like to thank Bhavnagar University for organizing this timely webinar sessions on an issue which touches most of us today. And also thanks to my dear friend and colleague, Professor Dilip Singh Barat, for inviting me to do this presentation. The title of my presentation is a bit confusing to some people whom I talk to about this presentation. But anyway, it is not that confusing. I have taken a couple of words. One word is taken from the poem that I'm going to focus on today, unwholesome, which you all know, unhealthy. And then stentorian is a word which talks about a powerful voice, which is something which is powerful. So I'll explain these things as I keep on speaking. So let us now first focus on what we understand by pandemic. From where does this word come? In the last 10, 15 years, I mostly deal with languages. So when you look at any dictionary, you will find that it comes from the Greek pan and demos. Pan means all and demos mean people. So in a way, it affects all people or a substantial number of people. So there is a difference between an epidemic and a pandemic. Not all the literatures that we talk about are dealing with epidemic. Some of them are also dealing with pandemic. So epidemic is a disease which spreads to different continents, almost to the whole world, which COVID-19 is. Now, epidemic may be concentrated in one particular region, in one particular continent, in one particular country, in one particular state. Now, in the history, we find that the plague or Black Death, which Atanu also referred to, which took place in the 14th century, was the most fatal pandemic in human history. And I can give you a first-hand, I can tell you a first-hand story of what I saw. In 2012, I went to Glasgow. Now in Glasgow, there is a church, which is one of the oldest churches, which existed even in the 12th, 13th, 14th century. And at the back of the church is a huge crematorium. So when I visited the church, I looked around and I saw paintings and lots of artifacts which actually tell us about what happened in 14th century England. And I was told that almost 90% population of Glasgow was eliminated. And I could see how the people were actually cremated at the back of the church. So that was the scale of the pandemic in 14th century. And you all know that even the King of England quarantined himself in his palace for more than a year, and he didn't come out like Boris Johnson and got the COVID-19. And we also know about and talk about Spanish flu, we talk about AIDS, and we also talk about COVID-19. Now, why should we revisit it and rethink about literature in the context of this coronavirus pandemic? Now, why we should do this? Now, here I will consider three questions. The first question is, what features of pandemic do we find in literary writings in general? How do the writers respond to the disease causing it? So my reference to Christina Rossetti's poem or sonnet actually is a writer's response to the disease. And the third question is, what fictionalization or textualization of pandemics to tell us about the real world survival? So how we survive. So what were our survival strategies, our survival strategies? We all know about some of these texts. For example, Boccaccio's The Decameron, which the professor was referring to a few minutes back. And he was telling us about the entertaining almost 100 novellas that Boccaccio came up with. But what is more important to note there, that men and women, hundreds of men and women played the plague, which was then affecting the people in the city. Now, here, please try to notice the suddenness of the event, the plague, and also try to notice the escapist attitude of the people, that they escape and then they entertain themselves. Some people may say that, okay, they are actually fictionalizing, and in the fictionalizing world, no, you can have this kind of entertainment of your own. We will come to a few other texts which actually fictionalizes all these diseases. If you have a look at Thomas More's Utopia, once again, you come to see of an utopian world which talks about equality, which talks about communal ownership, which talks about democratic norms, and all these are set counter to life-threatening plague. So we promise a life which will be full of equality, communal ownership, democratic values, and which will relieve us of the menace of plague. So that there is a kind of a pointing and counterpointing of the two kinds of life, one promised by the plague and another promised by the construction of this utopian world. Think about Francis Bacon also. Now, in Bacon's New Atlantis, we actually come to talk about another utopian island called Bensalem. Now, in this utopian island, we see the foreigners were quarantined to protect the other islands from the spread of the disease. So, the notion of people being quarantined and this quarantine strategy being used to protect people from the disease is envisioned here in Francis Bacon's New Atlantis. Now proceed to Daniel Defoe's A Journal of the Plague Year, which Atanu referred to. Now there we find a journey, once again a fictionalized journey. Now here the journey is of the people to the countryside from the urban settlings. Now, people moved to countryside just as people moved in the Decameron. Now, they moved to keep themselves safe during the plague, which was then ravaging London. Now, so in a journal of the plague year, we come to know about a story of a city which is locked down, which actually faces a kind of a mass hysteria, which suffers from a lot of superstition, unemployment situation, fraud, looting, and all kinds of things like this. So these are fictionalized, presented, textualized in A Journal of the Plague Year. Then we come to Camus' The Plague, which we all know. In Camus' Plague, we come to see a different thing. I am not going to discuss the plague in details, but what I want to draw your attention to, think about the healthcare workers that you see today. Now, the kind of love and solidarity and dedication that these healthcare workers exhibit, even amidst loss and death, that is exemplary. And Camus actually was trying to tell us how people can come together in this kind of a crisis to resist the plague, to resist the pandemic. Now, to be more contextualized, I would say that when the Nazis invaded France, nobody in the France thought that they would be able to free themselves from this Nazi invasion. Some people thought, okay, this would continue forever. Some people thought that, okay, this would end after some months, some weeks. Just as we are now thinking that COVID-19 will end after a few months, few weeks, few days, or we may be perpetually locked down in a kind of a situation like this. So there is a kind of a reference to that, or we can draw a reference to Camus also as well, to link up it with our context. Then if you look at Jose Saramago's blindness, now here you find that the dwellers or inhabitants of a city, they suddenly go blind and they are quarantined in a ward, and doctors and nurses were sent there for treatment, and Saramago is telling us about it. There's something which was envisioned in 1995, which is something of a situation that you can now envision. Right now you can envision, right, that how people are actually taken to quarantine center and they tested positive and then they were treated. We come to see about this. And then we move to Philip Roth, 2010, Nemesis. Now here Roth actually recreates the terror, the fear, and also the feeling of helplessness among the population who were facing the threat of polio, right, who were affected by polio in 19th century when there is no vaccination actually available. Now, so what we see as the features of pandemic in literature is there is a kind of a suddenness, there is a loss of death, and there is this kind of a tension between the local and the communal, whether the infection is localized or it has spread to community, uncertainty. We don't know today what is going to happen in the next 2 months in India. Quarantine, hysteria. For example, right now I am quarantined and living in my own house for the last 2 months. There is a hysteria, fear, terror, which is there gripping us. Superstition is also there. If you take this, if you take hot water, if you take this, and if you will not have this this disease. The unemployment is a big issue. Nobody knows what is going to happen with these workers, and many people are losing their jobs and already have lost their jobs. There is a looting and fraud that is going on, at least in some parts of West Bengal. In a couple of days back, we saw that. And also, there is a feeling of a kind of a powerlessness, because we see we can't do anything. We can get the disease at any point of time and we may die, but we cannot do anything because we don't know the exact cure of it. So what are the writers' response in general? The writers actually recreates the fear, the feeling of uncertainty, helplessness amongst the large section of population. And the writer's response is that the writers also tell us about how love, solidarity, and dedication can actually resist the spread of the disease we see in the healthcare workers. And it also tells us about how people can, be together to fight together this this pandemic. Now, I would like you to have a quick look at Christina Rossetti's The Plague. Christina Rossetti is not a very well-read sort of a poet, one of poetess. One of my friends was telling me that he wanted to do a PhD on Christina Rossetti, but none of the university professors were interested. Now, so because maybe in some people's mind, she's just a minor writer. But this poem is very interesting, and it actually captures some of the things which are actually happening right now. Listen, the last stroke of death's noon has struck. The plague is come. The gnashing madman said, and laid him down straightway upon his head. His wreathed hands did at the linen pluck. Then all is over. So it refers to a person who is dead, because he was affected with plague and he has now died. So he was covered with a linen now and is ready to be taken away to a crematorium. With a careless chuck among his fellows he is cast. So nobody is bothered about it. It's indifferent. When you see deaths all around, you become indifferent sometimes. How spade his spirit matters little. Many dead make men hard-hearted. Place him on the truck. Go forth into the burial ground. This actually takes us to meaning the television scenes which were telecast a month before. Italy, the military trucks were lined up to take the dead body to the crematorium. Go forth into the burial ground and find room at so much a pitfall for so many. So there is not an adequate space to bury people. One thing is to be done. One thing is clear. So what is the most important thing in this hour of crisis? Keep thou back from the hot, unwholesome wind. So the disease is airborne. So unhealthy air. So you have to protect yourself. You have to protect from the infection, that it infect not thee. That should be the main criteria now, main concern. Say, is there any who mourn? Who mourn for the multitude dead here? Now, so what do we learn by looking at all these literary texts? By revisiting them, we learn that what we are experiencing, we start thinking about what we are experiencing. So we read Camus, we read Roth, we read Bacon, and we think, okay, this is something that humanity experienced earlier, and how they survived. So how they are actually narrativized, fictionalized, chronicled, that actually help us to think about. And maybe they give us some kind of strength that humanity earlier faced such situation and actually overcame it. Time and again, such catastrophic death assemblage will revisit us. So it's not that the COVID-19 will be over in 1 year or 2 years, or we'll find some cure and vaccine, and in the next 30 years we'll be safe. No, it may revisit us in a different form of a pandemic. So, and then it also enlightens us about nature. So see what is happening, how it is impacting on nature, on the whole world, on our relationship with each other. So it makes us think about it. It tells us to be vigilant, but not to be complacent. So that's what we learn from literature. Thank you very much. I wish that you are all safe and you take care to be safe.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Kalyan. That was very interesting. Thanks a lot. I'm indeed very glad to see also that all the plenary speakers are maintaining the time slots also. Thank you, all of you. And now the fourth and the final speaker of this session, Dr. Avishek Parui from IIT Madras, Chennai, Tamil Nadu is going to join us. Dr. Avishek.
Yeah, hi. Am I audible now? Can everyone hear me?
You are audible, sir. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. So at the very outset, I would like to thank Professor Dilip Bharat for giving me this opportunity, and would like to congratulate him for organizing such a fabulous conference, a webinar on such an urgent theme. I mean, this is a theme that is, it's not really academic, it's experiential. It's something we're living today. It's something we are experiencing today. And I think the experientiality is something we need to discuss at length. What is this pandemic doing to us at a very experiential, existential level? So I think this is a moment in time where academia meets existence, and we really need to blend the disciplines together. Everything needs to blend together for our survival's sake. Now, the title of my presentation, if you can call it a presentation, is Affect Contagion. So what is contagion, what is affect, and how is literature related to these categories, right? So I'm just going to start by defining what my working definition for affect. So affect is something, A-F-F-E-C-T, affect theory, as some of you would know, is a very topical thing in literature, in academia, and literary theory. So affect is anything which sticks, which spreads by sticking. So obviously there's a contagious quality about affect. It could be an effect of happiness. It could be an effect of sadness. It could be an effect of hysteria. It could be an effect of mourning. It could be an effect of rage, anything, right? So, and all these can potentially become political, as all of you know. Some of the greatest revolutions in the world have happened because of contagion of affect. It spread like wildfire. And of course, we are living at a time where we take pride, or rather we used to take pride in the fact that something went viral, right? So when a piece of information went viral, that was almost positive. The word viral had begun to become positive in our vocabulary. Perhaps not so anymore. Perhaps we are more modest now. Perhaps we're more careful in using the word viral now. If anything, this pandemic has made us more modest, more humble. So perhaps when we revisit the word viral, we will be more careful in not attaching any positivity to it. So viral is something which spreads, something which is contagious, something which which has a stickiness to it, and all this affect, the effect of anger, the effect of mourning, the effect of sorrow, the effect of happiness, it can all potentially soak us. And literature, of course, is a very effective medium. So I was listening to the second speaker, and he's talking about the metaphors, and I was really happy that someone mentioned this before I came in. The whole idea of metaphor metaphor or literary writing is affective writing. It is something which is supposed to move you emotionally, existentially, affectively. So literature is not just effective writing, it's also affective writing, A-F-F-E-C-T-I-V-E. That's the reason why we get affected when we read a poem. That's the reason why lyric moves us. That's the reason why novels move us. That's the reason why, conversely also, that's the reason why novels get banned. So we can think of the novels getting banned, and not so many history books get banned. But you wonder why novels get banned, why fiction gets banned. And the reason is fiction, novel, these are effective instruments. This can actually be contagious. So when you read a novel, we can become angry, we can become political, we can become happy, it can spread. Now, having said that, the whole idea of contagion, the whole idea of the present contagion we're living in today, and as I mentioned, perhaps when we come out of it, hopefully we'll come out of it soon, we'll be more careful in using the word viral. Perhaps we will not use it so indiscriminately. Perhaps we will not celebrate the word viral the way we used to until recently. We'll be more careful. But so I think what we need to do, what I will do in the rest of my presentation is I look at certain literary theory, certain critical theory, and try to map that into our current condition. Now, one literary theory that I find very interesting, one literary concept that I find very interesting, especially in relation to what we're facing today, is a theory of defamiliarization. Now, most of you will know the term. It comes from Russian formalism. The Russian word for it is ostraniny. So ostraniny is defamiliarization. Something familiar suddenly, abruptly, dramatically becomes defamiliar. And the whole idea of defamiliarization becomes important because what we used to know, your usual neighborhood, your usual grocery store, your usual housing complex, everything that you know, your neighbors, suddenly become different, suddenly become strange. And this sudden production of strangeness, the sudden production of something unfamiliar is something I think this pandemic has done at a very contagious level, at a very effective level. It's a global thing. So what we're looking at is a global activity of defamiliarization, a global activity of estrangement, a global activity of ostraniny, the Russian word for it. Suddenly everything is very defamiliar. Suddenly everything is not what it used to be. Even language becomes defamiliar. Like I mentioned before I started my discourse, that perhaps when we go back to the word viral, we will not use it as a celebratory metaphor. Perhaps we'll be more cautious, more guarded, because that word viral has now become perhaps permanently defamiliarized. So what we're looking at, what we are facing at a very existential, experiential level is an activity in defamiliarization. It's something which we can't cope with, something which we can't define, something which we can't give a name to. And of course, there are lots of novels we can think of, lots of fiction where defamiliarization has been used very effectively. So, for example, those of you who read Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness would know, this whole idea of the environment suddenly becomes something else, suddenly becoming something else, suddenly becoming strange, or rather, the sudden production of strangeness is something which happens a lot in Conrad. And as I mentioned before I began my discourse, that we're living at a time where fiction and reality have blended into each other. We don't quite know what is fiction and what is real anymore, and that's the whole point of defamiliarization. Reality is stranger than fiction. Reality is more defamiliarized, shall we say, than fiction. So that is one term that I find quite useful. And in terms of mapping that term, defamiliarization, into illness, into a sickness, into a health condition. I think a very important essay that I find quite useful, because one of my research interests is medical humanities. One of the essays that I find quite useful is an essay by Virginia Woolf. It's called On Being Ill. Some of you, again, may have read it. Some of you may have written papers on it. On Being Ill by Virginia Woolf is about the experience of being ill, the experience of being suddenly sick. So what happens to the body? What happens to your health? What happens to your mind when it suddenly becomes sick? And Woolf uses a range of metaphors in that essay. And one of the metaphors which I find quite useful is a metaphor of a strike, like similar to what happens to a city during strike. Everything shuts down. The streets shut down, the shops shut down, everything normal shuts down. So normalcy is interrupted. And again, the production of interruption is what we're looking at as well. So that in that particular essay, and again, this might be familiar to most of you, in that essay, Woolf equates the bodily interruption with urban interruption. And isn't that exactly what we're facing today? The body, we don't know our body anymore. We don't know if we are infected. Perhaps we're scared to test ourselves. We don't know if we are also contagious, that we can spread the contagion. Equally, when you go out in the streets, we find a strange city, the city that we used to know. I live in Chennai, for example, where people come from all over India in this particular webinar. All we need to do is step out to our once familiar road and see it so suddenly and so dramatically defamiliarized. So this equation between urban space and body, this equation between sort of urban ethnography and the biological state of being, that is coming to being so fabulously and so dramatically and perhaps so scarily in this particular pandemic, right? So the whole idea of defamiliarization is something that I think can be mapped very, very conveniently and very fruitfully and perhaps very originally into what we're living today. So On Being Ill by Virginia Woolf, where she equates the body during defamiliarization, the body during sickness, with a sick city, with a sickness, with the city suddenly coming to a being, with the suddenly city coming to an interruption, is something which I find quite useful. Now, if we want to extend this into a more direct critique of capitalism, perhaps, in terms of how this pandemic can be seen as an interruption of the capitalist production, consumption mechanism. Again, a very interesting theory, and I'm a critical theorist, so I draw a lot on theory. A very interesting theory that I draw on in order to study what we are looking at today is the theory of deterritorialization by Deleuze and Guattari. Again, it's probably familiar to most of you. So Deleuze and Guattari have this fantastic book called Capitalism and Schizophrenia. And they look at schizophrenia as exactly the way Wolf looks at illness, in terms of something which happens to the body as an interruption. Suddenly, everything is defamiliarized. So schizophrenia, again, is the production of alterity, is the production of otherness, the production of strangeness. And in this particular case, in this particular pandemic, it has become an act of permanent production. We don't quite know when this production consumption will stop. So in some sense, it's a bit like those of us who see zombie cinema would know. It is exactly what zombie cinema does, good zombie cinema. Like, for example, if you watch a film like 28 Days Later by Danny Boyle, when a man wakes up from coma after 28 days, and London as a city is suddenly come to an end. London as a city is defamiliarized, it's been taken over. There has been some deadly virus, everyone's dead except the military and zombies. And how does it negotiate with that strangeness, right? So zombie cinema can also be seen as a critique of capitalism in some sense. So I find this particular condition of pandemic as a very strange and absurd critique of capitalism, because, you know, at a very immediate level, what happens during this pandemic? The shops close down. The shopping malls closed down, the cinema halls closed down, our spaces of consumption closed down, right? Our spaces of public consumption closed down. That's the first thing to go. That's the first casualty during this pandemic, right? And this interruption in the capitalist production consumption chain is, I think, something which can be mapped very interestingly using Deleuze's Deleuze and Guattari's theory of deterritorialization. Now, interestingly, there is a catch to this. Those of you who read Schizophrenia and Capitalism would know this. When Deleuze and Guattari, when they talk about deterritorialization, they use the term deterritorialization in conjunction with reterritorialization. And that's the whole deal. Anything which has been deterritorialized will be reterritorialized. In other words, capitalism will always find a way to reuse strangeness. I hope I'm making sense. So capitalism will always find a way to market strangeness, to commodify strangeness, to commodify alterity. I mean, those of you who have interest in music would know that when MTV came into being, MTV as a global music industry came into being in the mid-90s, and again, those of you who are music fans would know, I mean, Kurt Cobain made a very famous statement. Kurt Cobain, the Nirvana singer, he said that nothing works better for MTV's consumption than an anti-MTV statement. And that's what I'm trying to say. Nothing works better for MTV's consumption than an anti-MTV statement. In other words, MTV as a capitalist frame will always look for strength, will always look for standardization, and will always find a way to market that, to commodify strangeness, to commodify alterity, to commodify defamiliarization. So, you know, when Deleuze and Guattari talk about deterritorialization, they always use the term in conjunction with reterritorialization. So anything which can be deterritorialized will be potentially reterritorialized. So schizophrenia can become capitalist. Schizophrenia can be marketed. Schizophrenia can be produced, reproduced as consumer goods in some sense, right? And this is why it becomes interesting, because when you come to this particular pandemic, the fact that no one has any clue, no one has any idea, no one has any definition in terms of what this is, what the healing mechanism for this is, how this is going to work, how this is going to pan out, when is this going to end. It means this is a very strange case when Deleuze's deterritorialization has not reached reterritorialization. I hope I'm making sense. So the whole idea of deterritorialization has become an act of permanent suspension. It is permanently deterritorialized. There's no reterritorialization available yet. right? And its unavailability of re-territorialization is what makes this pandemic a really interesting study from a perspective of literary and critical theory. So, and I'm just going to wind up now using some classic Marxist terms, some very classic Marxist terms, which I think have been dramatically revised and reconfigured. The whole idea of production and alienation. Right now, in classic Marxist terminology, alienation is the removal of the worker from the product. So the worker produces a product, but the worker cannot access the product. If you remember, for example, the Chaplin film, Modern Times, the workers are inside the factory and the product is outside, right? The workers have no access to the product. And this removal, this distancing from the product is what makes alienation. You remove from what you produce, right? But in this particular pandemic, I think this is really reconfigured alienation in a very interesting way. Alienation has become a norm. Alienation has become a necessary condition. Alienation has become a defense mechanism in some sense, right? So it's not really about production consumption. Alienation, the Marxist alienation, has suddenly become biological. So we were looking at, again, this is what I meant when I started off this lecture. We're looking at an epoch in time when academia and experience must blend together, right? So this very theoretical Marxist term of alienation, production, reification, commodification have suddenly become very experiential. We must be alienated from each other if we are to survive. So alienation has become a biologically normative condition. It's something which is normatively suggested, advised, recommended, right? So I think, and I end by congratulating the organizers again, because I think this particular topic of pandemic in literature is a very, very important topic. And I'm hoping the organizers will think of bringing out perhaps a volume out of this, a volume of published essays or whatever, because I think this is a moment in time when academia can really inform experience in ways that's never happened before. We can think of fiction, we can think of critical theory, we can think of medical humanities, we can think of memory studies, and we in IIT Madras, we have a center of memory studies. Of course, we're going to look at this pandemic in a very direct way once we get back to work. So I think this particular topic is something which we need to really look at from a critical theory lens: deterritorialization, defamiliarization, alienation, etc. And I'll just end with this. I'll end with a genre of literature that I find I've always been fascinated with. And I think this genre has suddenly become perhaps the most appropriate genre to define our time. And that is the genre of absurd theater, right? Because aren't we looking at a condition of absurdity? Aren't we theatricalizing it ourselves? Aren't we living in a theater of the absurd at the moment, where we are alienated from each other, where everyone is a stranger? I mean, think of the Harold Pinter plays. We don't know who comes in, who goes out. We don't know whose name is what. We don't know who is infected and who is not infected. Strange people come, capture strange people, go away. And again, this is what I meant when I mentioned the production of strangeness. This pandemic has been a production of strangeness, and it's been a permanent production of strangeness. So I think absurd theater is perhaps one very, very interesting lens to look at, to look through this particular condition we are living in. And I'll just end with a quotation of Beckett, which I think is perhaps the best thing we can do to ourselves. That is the acceptance of this condition. Beckett mentioned, well, you are on Earth. There's no cure for that. And I think that's something we need to really look at deeply and understand with full significance. So I'll end with this, and I congratulate the organizers again for giving me this opportunity, and also for conceiving this fantastic symposium. And I'm very much hoping we get something tangible out of this. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Avishek. That was very, very interesting. Very interesting. Yeah, thanks a lot. At this juncture, let me also remind Dr. Archana from Anna Adarsh College, who suggested your name. And it is great to have you on this webinar. Thanks for
It's been an honor. Thank you very much. It's been an honor.
Yeah. Okay, so our four speakers have completed their brief talk on literature and epidemic, and very interesting insights have been thrown into this very aspects. And we know that this is perhaps now the need of the hour, that several new researchers, young scholars will get interesting ideas to work on their PhD researches on epidemics and literature also. Now I would like to request Professor Chetan Trivedi sir to offer a few words on this session. Professor Chetan Trivedi sir is the chief guest of this inaugural session. A brief introduction of Dr. Chetan Trivedi sir. He is a very dynamic Vice Chancellor of a newly emergent University of Gujarat, Bhakta Kavi Narsingh Mehta University, Junagadh. He is just the second Vice Chancellor of this new university, and he is doing wonderful work to establish the strong foundation of the university in Junagadh region. Dr. Chetan Trivedi is also the alumni of our department. We are proud of our alumni like Dr. Chetan Trivedi, who has reached the pinnacle of achievements in academia and is providing a wonderful leadership example there. On this occasion, I would like to tell that two of our alumni are vice chancellors in the universities of Gujarat nowadays. The another one is Dr. Ami Upadhyay, who is the vice chancellor of Baba Saheb Ambedkar Open University, and this is really a matter of pride for our department there. Apart from that, he's also a very good friend of our department and is always ready to help in various aspects also. So, Dr. Chetan Trivedi, sir, I would request you to have your words on this occasion, sir.
Am I audible to all?
Yeah.
Yes, very good noon to all of you. First of all, let me congratulate Professor Bharat and the Vice Chancellor of Maharaja Krishna Kumar Siji University, Bhavnagar, Mahipatsinh Ji, to start with this series of webinars. In fact, the Education Department of Gujarat, under the leadership of our Education Minister, has started a mohim to have several webinars just to reach to the level of unrest of students community on various topics. And as you know, always Professor Bhanu, innovative in the sense of the nature, he has taken up the lead and pick up a very important topic of the need and the demand of the time. And the data, whatever I have received, I'm very happy to see that the session will run from 8:30 morning to late evening. More than 150 presenters have presented their papers and abstracts. Out of them, they have selected 80 presentations. That's very good. And almost all, today I was amazed to listen all these 4 plenary speakers. They all have, even though given 20 minutes, but those 20 minutes are itself a thesis in their nature. And there's almost all 12 plenary speakers across India, Madhya Pradesh, Maharashtra, Telangana, Kerala, Tamil Nadu, West Bengal, and Gujarat. In a way, it's a sense of the term, true sense, a national seminar. And there are more than 1300 registration from almost all states of India, from Jammu Kashmir to Kerala, from Gujarat to West Bengal. So this is a new beginning, and this webinar, a newer kind of webinar, this Corona has taught us a lot. With what I usually call it coronical education. So before Corona and after Corona, there is a tremendous change in education, because the place where I am working, it's a tremendous rural area where people are having less exposure of education. We are less dealing with technology, but in this last 50 days, we have started all kind of experiments with technology, and people have accepted those changes in technology. So in a way, this Corona, if you take it or think it positively, it has also given some new messages and some new understanding to self, society, and government also. Now, coming back to the topic, literature is always the mirror of society, as you know, Matthew Arnold's term. And literature always reproduces, and we have had a very tremendous poor speaker, Atanu and Kalyan, very good friend of mine. Even they are my friend, philosopher, and guide also, along with Professor Bharat. The way in which Dr. Atanu has talked about negotiating disaster, and he has referred a very apt Mangal Kavya, folk tales. So this kind of, these are the possibilities from where this Corona would enter into the literature. And he has nicely talked about translating the popular and imagination of disaster. So these are some of the things that he has talked in a very small time, but put in a very apt way. Then Mr. Bhatt has talked about the social vision of this corona. In fact, I had 3 or 4 meetings today, but I have cancelled all the meetings, and I wanted to be the part of this webinar to know and understand the various trends in corona. And then, as usual, Kalyan is very technical and methodological. As in the beginning, he's talked about revisit and rethink of literature in a newer way, and has given a nice way of these features of pandemic. Then how this rule of survival in a short way. He has also given a list of some good text, and has nicely introduced one of the forgotten name, Christiana Rossettini, one of the pre-Raphaelite school of poet, and has a mixed up, all blended kind of thing, which is very useful. And at last, Avishek has nicely come with that theory of de-tutorialization. That is something which is very known to us, all of us, in new coming days, and has also shown the possibilities of theater of absurds, the genre of theater of absurd in new coming days. So I'm very happy all these 4 panelist speakers have justified their time and the value of the time of the listener also. And in short, it was a good beginning. And when we say good beginning is always a half done, so most of the things are done. Here also, yesterday night, I was just, we have a digital competitions. Government of Gujarat has declared digital competitions, and we have been receiving so many poems. So I was just looking at how the young minds are looking in the sense of the drawing competition, essay writing competition, and poetry writing competition along with recitation. So I was just going through that result sheet, and I received one poem. I would like to recite that poem here to put it to the notice how what the young mind, the young students, the learner from rural side looking at the corona. So this will also be a new vista of understanding of corona. The boy writes in Hindi, यही संकट रहा तो जिंदगी के दुख कौन बांटेगा, यही संकट रहेगा तो जिंदगी के दुख कौन बांटेगा, अकेलेपन से लड़ते आदमी के दुख कौन बांटेगा, जहां पर दूरिया दिल में बहुत पहले से हो कायम, जहां पर दूरिया दिल में बहुत हो पहले से कायम, वहां पर पास रहकर आदमी के दुख कौन बांटेगा, अभी तो हवाओं की नमी में है वायरस जिंदा, अभी तो हवाओं की नमी में है वायरस जिंदा, अभी तो गले मिलकर भाइयों के दुख कौन बांटेगा, यहाँ पर बंद सब कुछ काम हाथों में नहीं कोई, यहाँ पे बंद लॉकडाउन, यहाँ पे बंद सब कुछ काम हाथों में नहीं कोई, यहाँ भूखे और प्यासे आदमी के दुख कौन बांटेगा, अभी सब अपने अपने अजनबी से नजर आते हैं, अभी सब अपने अपने अजनबी से नजर आते हैं, अभी अपनायत के साथ सुख दुख कौन बांटेगा, कि जिस दुनिया में होगी वायरस की खेतियां उसमें, कि जिस दुनिया में होगी, this is the reference to something which is different, कि जिस दुनिया में होगी वायरस की खेतियां इसमें तड़प कर मरने वालों के भला दुख कौन बांटेगा, ये दुनिया क्या इसी दिन के लिए हमने बनाई है, ये दुनिया क्या इस दिन के लिए बनाई है, न होगा आदमी तो आदमी के दुख कौन बांटेगा. So in that way, how look at the young students, new learners have started looking at corona, and I know it is almost all 2:18 and I have been given only 10 minutes, but this is what I would like to just recollect all whatever the speakers have taught, my own idea, and at last I wish this will always would come up with some new questions, new queries, like how did writers deal with the epidemics. I request Professor Bharat to have a publication with this all papers and all, and this will be a new vision for new learners and new researchers. First, how did writers deal with the epidemics? Second, what were the metaphors of epidemics in literature? What lessons are learned by posterity from such literature? And how has historiography or literature deal with the epidemics? These are some of the questions that I am putting it to the august audience, that all the presenters do keep in mind. And once again, I am thankful to Professor Bharat, my own university and my department, Maharaja Krishna Kumar Ji University and Department of English. My dear friend Mahipatsinh Ji is also with us for such a wonderful initiation. And thank you very much all. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, sir. It was wonderful. Thanks a lot. Yeah. Now I would like to invite our Honourable Vice Chancellor, Dr. Mahipatsinh Chavda sir, to address the speakers, the participants, and bless the occasion. Yes, sir.
Bharat sir,
Yeah, sir. You are there, sir. Yeah, this.
good afternoon.
Just a minute, sir. Just a minute, sir. Let me introduce our Vice Chancellor to the audience. Dr. Mahipatsinh Chavda sir, again, is a very dynamic personality, a great man to lead an academic institute for last 1.5 years. He has joined our university, and he has kept everybody on the foot. Lots of seminars, conferences, and even during lockdown, he was just planning that in case the lockdown is lifted, what work we are going to do. So that was wonderful. That always looking forward progressively. And he says that I have 3 years and I want to see that I can take this university somewhere as an example that can be cited by the people. Sir, your leadership is really interesting. Everybody is being guided and motivated by your spirit of work there. So we invite you to say a few words on this occasion, Dr. Mahipatsinh Chavda sir.
Good afternoon to all, and welcome to eminent speakers and chief guest of this seminar, and my dear friend, Dr. Chetan Trivedi, participants and dear students. I am happy to inform that MK Bhavnagar University has been organizing series of webinars on various topics like art and literature, economic and social impact of COVID-19, digital marketing, finance, spread facts, not fear, literature and epidemics, yoga and sports, use of web tools and cloud computing by various departments of this university during 2nd May to 21st May 2020. This webinar is hosted by English Department on Literature and Epidemics for 2 days, 16th and 17th May 2020. The sessions will run from 8:30 a.m. to late evening. There were around 150 paper presenters. 80 are selected for presentation. There are 12 plenary speakers from all over India, Madhya Pradesh, Maharashtra, Telangana, Kerala, Tamil Nadu, West Bengal, and Gujarat. There are 1,300 registrations from almost all states of India, from Jammu and Kashmir to Kerala and Gujarat to West Bengal. There are 3 plenary sessions and 5 paper presentation sessions. The topic of webinar is relevant to ongoing coronavirus pandemic. While the medicos and scientists are busy in labs to find the vaccine to eradicate COVID-19, this webinar attempts to look at how literature has responded to similar epidemics in past. We human beings have witnessed several such pandemics, epidemics, calamities on large scales. Every time, literary writers stand up to give literary expression to such pandemics. One of the most talked about literary work during this corona epidemic is Albert Camus' The Plague. It is a story of a city named Oran, wherein suddenly plague strikes and all lives are disturbed. Literary writers are not historians, so they do not only write about what happened, but they go deeper and philosophic over the epidemic. In Camus' novel, the plague is more than a diabolical external force imposing its will. Camus writes, each of us has the plague within him. No one on earth is free from it. I hope the deliberations of this webinar will bring out similar deeper truths about human existence in the midst of corona pandemic. I have come to know that many presenters are also reading Indian writers like Rabindranath Tagore and how they have dealt with epidemics in India. many of you are also reading films to study the effect of epidemics. I wish all the best to all the participants for the webinar. On behalf of MK Bhavnagar University, I am thankful to all the eminent plenary speakers from various parts of India. Thank you for sparing your time and enriching knowledge and understanding of everybody. Once again, best wishes to all who are part of this webinar of literature and epidemics. In last, a special thanks to Vice Chancellor of Narsee Mehta University, Dr. Chetan Trivedi, and I also congratulate to convener of this webinar and his team for organizing such type of successful webinar. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, sir. Your blessings, your words are very important, and your also an insight into this topic also was very interesting to listen from you. Your topic is psychology, but still you have talked a very interesting thing about epidemics and literature also. Thanks a lot, sir. Thank you. Now, a brief announcement after a formal thanks to all the speakers, Dr. Atanu Bhattacharya, sir, Kamalakar Bhat, sir, Kalyan Chattopadhyay, sir, Avishek Parui, sir, Chetan Trivedi, sir, Mahipatsinh Chavda, sir. We are all thankful to you as a coordinator of this webinar. I am heartily thankful to everybody. All the participants, almost the hall remained full, and there are so many people watching on Facebook and YouTube. Thanks to all of you also for being with us in this occasion. We are not breaking for any time, and within 3 or 4 minutes, we are starting our second plenary sessions. All the speakers are already on the panel, but we just take a small break. We are online, we are not breaking off. Just within 3 minutes, the new panel is coming up. Thank you, all of you. Thank you, sir.
Very nice, Bharat Sahib. Thank you, Chetan bhai.
Mahipatsinh, બહુ સરસ થયો. It was a nice program, wonderful program. આપની leadership માં બહુ સારા કાર્યક્રમો થાય છે.
બસ બીજી તારીખથી શરૂ કર્યા છે. 21 તારીખ સુધીમાં 9 જેટલા વેબિનાર.
તમે ઘણો રસ લઈ રહ્યા છો. અતનુજી कैसे हो? कल्याण थे क्या जता रहा? कल्याण है या निकल गए? So how are you? अतनु, कल्याण जी भी आ गए.
अतनु सर नमस्कार.
अरे चेतन,
नमस्कार, कैसे हो?
चल रहा है अभी लॉकडाउन, घर में बैठा हूँ. ऐसा ही हालत है.
We have to start living with this corona.
Yeah, it seems now we have to live with it.
Where are you, Atanu ji? Are you at Gandhinagar or?
Gandhinagar, Chetan.
Is all well?
Gandhinagar only. Came back before the lockdown. Yeah. Just before the lockdown started, I was in Vidyanagar. Then I came back, 23rd.
Okay, shall I take your leave because I have some other assignments to do? So
Sure, sir. Thank you, Chetan.
Bye.
Very good afternoon once again to everybody in this second plenary session. In this session, we have Dr. Balaji Ranganathan, Dr. Sachin Ketkar, and Dr. Valiur Rahaman joining us in this session. So first of all, I would request Dr. Balaji Ranganathan to come online, put on your mic and a video. Yes, sir. You are there.
Am I audible and visible?
Yes, sir. You are audible, visible, sir. Yeah. Please continue, sir.
Thank you, Professor Bharat. I'll begin by thanking the Bhavnagar University and you personally for inviting me here. It's hugely a pleasure coming onto a very new kind of a format where we're exchanging ideas. And I realize that we are short on time and we're running short on time. So what I'll do is I'll start talking about this entire notion of what I was planning to do on catastrophes and the art of Gothic writing and the nature of Gothic writing. It's a short presentation, so I'll be keeping within my time limit. Yeah, so the objective of this talk is largely to focus on the nature of the pandemic as shaping the literary imagination by examining the nature of behavioral responses. The large import of this presentation is that the responses to the idea of public and global health was also mirrored by a narrative that took a form within art and literature. So what I'll be doing here within this talk is to examine the nature, the idea of fear, the nature of dread and fascination within a few theoretical frames. Specifically, I'll be looking at two of them. I'll be looking at the idea of the uncanny, that was outlined by Freud, and later developed into the idea of abject by Julia Kristeva. And then I'll focus on two basic representations that came out within the American Gothic form of writing, American and one, the French Gothic form of writing. And the larger idea and the larger import of this is to see how it went on to develop this idea of a global health policy and the process by which it was founded. So when we're talking about Gothic fiction, it's a very nebulous category in the sense, hardly anything Gothic in it, in the sense it's mostly post-medieval, it's mostly a post-Renaissance phenomenon, and you find this actually developing by a text that came out in 1765 by Horace Walpole's The Castle of Toronto, and it came out of the Sidonian. In a sense, if you look at the preface, it was talking about this kind of a blending of two kinds of romances, the idea of the ancient and the modern, the idea of the imagination and improbability that was governed by the rules of probability and yet connected with common life. That was the larger import of what Walpole was trying to do. That's surprising. Quite a lot of musical skill. And one thing that it does cater to is, or I would say panders to, is this notion of dread and the idea of horror. Because most of these Gothic tales, if you look at the basic locales and the settings, it's extremely dystopian in today's terms. In the sense it would be antiquated spaces, in the sense you're talking about a castle, an abbey, a prison, a subterranean crypt, a graveyard. It could be a primeval frontier or an island. It could be an old home, a theater, an aging city. It could be an urban underworld, a decaying storehouse, factories, laboratories, public buildings, and so on and so forth. And in a sense, you're going to have this entire range, ranging from the old filing cabinets to the entire idea of urban spaces that is associated with the nature of the Gothic. And then that's going to be very, very crucial when we're going to look at how urban spaces go on, how urban spaces, yeah, can I continue? Yeah. Specifically when you're looking, there's somebody speaking in between. Yeah, Mr. Hasya Reddy G. Can you please mute? Yeah, thank you. Yeah. So there's an entire notion of public spaces that are associated with the idea of the Gothic. In a sense, there's always this shift to the past that's happening within the Gothic. And you have sort of secrets of the past, or you could have a repetition of certain categories from the past that come in, and you would find that affecting the characters, not only psychologically and physically at the same time. So when you're talking about this notion of haunting, because remember, with any pandemic or any kind of a catastrophe, you're dealing with a category called fright, or to be frightened, or to be in a state of dread. Let me use the term dread, so that's a more acceptable category. It's an unexplained fear, isn't it? In a sense, this fear and the hauntings that happen, you would find it being reflected within Gothic fiction, Gothic writing, within two categories. In a sense, you could term it as the terror Gothic, and the other would be the horror Gothic. So when I term it as the terror Gothic, I'm mostly talking about how principal characters will be subjected to physical or some form of a psychological dissolution. In a sense, it would be something like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And where you're talking about how your assumed everyday norms are just devolving into a very revolting consequence. While your entire notion of a horror Gothic is something that I'm more interested in, where you're talking about the site of your unconscious, where you have certain deep-seated social, historical dilemmas, where they become all the more fearsome, mainly because the characters and readers who are unable to reconcile with them in a fundamental way. At the same time, you find this absolute display of a sexuality and a sexuality that is largely barred ahead. I'll be talking about this, and a very good example of this would be Frankenstein, because you're looking at an extremely kind of a sexless fabrication. It's an artificial creature. We're talking about monsters built up. We're talking about a person absolutely composed of pieces of graveyards and charnel houses, and suddenly confronting the dead body of his mother. And that's a very interesting symbol, because the mother ultimately goes on to become this psychic unconscious. And you find this tension that is continuously simmering, between the levels of culture, between the subliminal levels of culture and the larger political unconscious, because the political unconscious is largely to do with the notion of progress. And then remember, this is the Victorian, the 19th century, where you have the Industrial Revolution has already taken place. I mean, you're having this mass idea of mass production and so on and so forth. So the political unconscious is all about this engagement in this larger modern biochemistry, a biological, a certain mechanical reproduction. At the same time, you have this the social element that's coming in with this centrality and the marginality of women, and the larger problem of engaging with an emerging urban middle class, and probably the beginnings of capitalism that's happening. So when we're talking about this this particular genre, within the 20th century, the Gothic fictions have been largely dominated by these forms of psychoanalytical readings. At the same time, you're having various other platforms through which, or frameworks through which you're looking at Gothic, the structure of the Gothic, whether it's a neo-historicist or the cultural studies, maybe because you're going to find a number of problems and issues that are informing the Gothic. For example, the problem of class, the problem of ideology, the problem of technological conflict. You're also talking about how the process of colonialism is functioning with the shifting of certain categories, of certain views that are coming in, the modes of gaze and so on and so forth. So it's this largely, you're talking about this half alive, half dead, half organic, half artificial, semi-desirable, absolutely repellent. These are the categories where you're going to locate your longings and fears, right? So in any pandemic, whether it's, a pandemic is just a small aspect of the Gothic, but any kind of a catastrophe, these are the problems. These are the basic points where you would focus your notions of longing and fears. In the sense, you're trying to make some understanding, you're trying to achieve some form of an understanding about your own nature of a being. There was a gentleman who talked about this entire idea of defamiliarization. This idea of the defamiliar. Yeah. So in a sense, you're coming into, when I'm talking about this liminal space where you're not yet in the state of being, you're not able to actually apprehend reality. At the same time, you're trying to grapple with this absolute sense of alienation, not in a Marxist sense, alienation in a sense where, let's say, your language is not in a state where you're able to grasp reality. That's where you come, if I can put it, into your Freudian notion, the uncanny. And it was Freud who was working on this particular essay where he's relooking E.T.A. Hoffman's Gothic short story, The Sandman, right? And it's in this particular essay, and it's not that Freud, and remember, I'm mentioning Freud mainly because Freud has to be understood absolutely within the nature of the Gothic. Even if you're going to look at this entire idea of the Oedipus, right? That idea of recognition that comes in within that original play by Sophocles, and the entire tragedy that surrounds it. Or when you're getting into Hoffman's short story, you're absolutely looking at that space of the Gothic. And Freud was very, very clear in the sense, what he did, what he felt was this idea of the aesthetic, because uncanny, the notion of dread, is within the category of the aesthetic. And it was this category of the aesthetic that was very important for Freud. It's not just a pathological idea of depression or of clinical depression, or he didn't use the term depression actually, he used the term hysteria. It was not just an idea of clinical hysteria. So what Freud is doing is he is actually working on, or he's actually trying to develop an idea that began with Ernest Jentz, who brought out a reading on the uncanny. He termed it on the psychology of the uncanny in 1906. It came out in 1906. And Jentz's idea was, when he was working on Hoffman's short story, The Sandman, Jentz felt that it's probably the automaton, because those who are not aware of the story, I would request you all to read it, because if I'm going to explain the entire story to you, I'm just going to be off time. Yeah. But what's happening here is there is this character called Nathaniel who hears the story of the Sandman. It's a part of the German folk. It's a German folk tale, and it comes in where this character is threatened with a loss of eyes, and in the process, Nathaniel develops a huge phobia for this entire character of the Sandman. And interestingly, within that particular story, you have, wait a minute. You have this optician called Capola who is entering it, and he works for his father, and both are opticians, and during a particular episode, he is found out that he's spying on actually what is happening, and he begins suspecting that Coppola himself is the Sandman, and in the process he's about to put out his eyes and so on and so forth. So I mean, there's this basic nature of fright that's going to inform him throughout the particular story. And later, as a university student, Nathaniel is going to fall in love with an automaton, you know, like a mannequin called Olympia, and at the end of it, Coppelius is going to come in, and literally dismantle that automaton. In the process, Nathaniel is going to lose his mind. I mean, he goes into progressive insanity, and he goes on to commit suicide. And Freud is trying to examine this particular story. So you have Jens, when he's looking at this entire episode, he is actually looking at automaton as a source of the threat. But it's Freud who goes on to say, no, it's not the automaton which is the problem. And for Freud, he's going to stress not on the automaton, but he's going to stress on this entire problem of the loss of eyes. It's extremely symbolic. It's symbolic, the loss of eyes, in the sense you're losing not only your ability to access your own being, but at the same time there is this intense fear of castration that is in the sense you're losing what Jacques Lacan would term as the larger impossibility of a subject ever, there's a larger impossibility of ever accessing your own drives because of this castration complex. So what the uncanny with Freud does is, and as I said, it's not just, as I said, this idea of dread has to be distinguished from fright. In the sense, to be frightened is something, and to experience dread is something different. All right, you might be frightened of the dark, you might be frightened of animals, you might be frightened of sounds and so on and so forth, but dread is a different category altogether. And mainly because dread is not something that can be mediated through the symbolic art. It cannot be mediated through language. You can't explain it. So in that sense, the idea of what Freud was talking about with the uncanny is basically our psychic economy, in the sense it's this castration complex that's a larger part of our infantile sexuality. Yeah, and dread is somewhere a return to your own psychosexual history. Right? In a sense, you'll never overcome it. You'll never access it. You might have partly forgotten it. And the moment you access your own psychosexual history, you suddenly find a release within your unconscious, or this return to a repressed infantile material, you're getting into that realm of dread. So a larger piece is what Freud was talking about, is anything that you experience in adulthood would remind you of your certain earlier psychic stages or aspects of your own unconscious life. And somewhere he's also mentioning, this primitive, primordial experience of the human species. That's what he is looking at. And this particular notion of the uncanny is carried forward by Julia Kristeva. And I'm focusing a lot on these two theorists, mainly because this entire idea of fright and dread, or this idea of alienation in a very loose sense, or this idea of being absolutely disconnected with reality right now with this pandemic on, is connected with this idea, right? So Julia Kristeva is the second frame I'm picking up, and in The Powers of Horror, she's talking about this entire idea of the abject, and she's working on this idea of the uncanny which Freud brought out. And of course, Kristeva will be looking at the uncanny, yes, but she'll also be looking at Jacques Lacan's model, but at the same time, she'll be critiquing Lacan's problem of ever thinking of a pre-linguistic space, right? Because if you're going to say all fright, all fear has to be mediated through language, then how do you look at a category like the uncanny where even your language doesn't function? Yeah. So what Kristeva is trying to talk about with this idea of the abject is she's looking at this entire notion of the human reaction, in the sense this absolute breakdown of meaning that is caused by the loss of this distinction between the subject, object, or between the idea of the self and the other. Yeah. So in a sense, what we understand as reality is this constant referential between a very clear knowledge of myself as a self and you as the other. All right? That's how language functions. But when that particular category breaks down, you're going to have a liminal space. You're going to have this unexplained idea, an unexplained area where you seriously cannot mediate through language. In the sense, for example, if you're going to look at a corpse, for instance. So you're going to, but some people have this weird sensations they say when they suddenly see blood on people's faces, or when they see an accident. It's not something that they can mediate through language. In the sense, it's a direct aversion. Yeah. So what Kristeva does is she's trying to say that if I can just sum this up, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but she says that there's this primal repression that is on, there's this absolute aversion that comes on, yeah, and at the same time she's also talking about something called an archaic memory, where you're going back to your old nature culture debate. All right, in the sense, the moment I say archaic memory, if I'm looking at culture or looking at the entire soft effects of culture, you're talking about the progress of civilization. And the moment you drop away from the ideas of from that cultural space, you're going back to a more animalistic frame. Yes. So this is precisely what happens in the event of a catastrophe. So in the event of a catastrophe, what happens is this breakdown of spaces, this breakdown of your comfort zones, breakdown of everything that is deemed familiar to you. And in the process, what happens is you lose your the trappings of civilization, right? You lose the trap. You might lose your feelings of empathy. You might lose your all your tropes within literature. The tropes of affection, tropes of love, tropes of joy, and so on and so forth. None of those tropes function. I mean, it's a classic case right now. You're supposed to maintain 8 feet distance, keep a mask on your face. Where's the question of empathy? Yeah, that is the larger problem of what getting back to a larger animalistic stages. In the sense, you're no longer, if I can use that, a terrible way of defining the Homo sapiens sapien. Man is a social animal, right? You're no longer a social animal. Terrible representation, but you're no longer a social animal, right? So in a sense, you're more animalistic, you're more individual, you're going to be more individualistic. Yeah. Now, keeping this idea of attitudes towards a catastrophe, or how a catastrophe would construct the attitudes, whichever way you want to look at it. And you saw this being mirrored across the 4 talks that we had in the first session, where you're trying to understand how would it affect the nature of states, nation states, the idea of nation states, their responses. How would it lead to this larger idea of a global health policy? Yeah. Now, is this idea of a global health policy a very recent phenomenon, or have people thought about a global health policy in response to a catastrophe or an epidemic earlier? Yeah. So this idea of a catastrophe, all right, was mirrored by color. Right? I'm looking at this idea of the growth of cholera that happened between 1817 and the 1890s, and it dominated the discourse across the world at that particular moment. And I'll also be looking at how there are two literary representations. Very briefly, I'll look at it, that center around cholera. One is Le Jeu Errant. It's a French novel, got translated as The Wandering Jew. And the other is Poe's short story, The Mask of Red Death. Yeah, but I'll be coming to that. So when you're talking about this origins, and interestingly, Sari Althusser has a wonderful work on this, the entire nature of a global public health policy that happened across the last 200 odd years. And she absolutely mentions that at the social and the material level, there was this huge explosion of urbanization. All right, you had transportation innovations, rapid demographic environmental changes that happened in the early 19th century. And this laid this groundwork for a global health approach. And this largely happened. This largely happened mainly because of cholera. Yeah. So what you're looking at in the 19th century is this paradigm where you're narrated the cholera epidemic. You're looking at the social consequences of the cholera epidemic and how exactly is it related to population demography, and how can it be related to factors like poverty and environment. This is something that's happening, and this is not something new, because this is the subject of colonialism, isn't it? I mean, if you look at the Columbian Exchange between Europe and the Americas, it was not just the exchange of crops and fruits and spices and chocolate and so on and so forth. We're not talking about just that. We're also talking about an exchange of pathogens. We're talking about an exchange of how the new world pathogens entered the old world. We are seeing the entire problem, what happened within the colonization of Latin America, with the entry of Francisco Pizarro and Herman Cortez and the Spanish conquistadors, and the entire conquest of the Yucatan Peninsula, the subjugation of the Mayan civilization, the subjugation of the Incas. What you saw was practically 90% of the Latin American population was wiped out not because of war, right? It didn't happen because of battle. It largely happened because they lacked an immunity towards the new world, in the sense of European world, the new world pathogens that were brought in, and they just didn't have the immunity. And then you're talking about millions of people dying. In the sense, the entire civilization broke down. So in the sense, we're talking about this idea. In the sense, pandemics is largely, I mean, you'll find it moving with this idea of capitalism and global expansion. All right. So colonialism was also a form of capitalism at one stage, and colonial travel also aided within this agency of transfer. They became an agency of transfer for all the pathogens that happened. So cholera would move. And then there's this entire Orientalistic idea of disease coming in from the Orient. All right. Right now we are talking about a Wuhan virus, a Chinese virus. Absolutely an Orientalistic frame that's coming in from the 19th century. We'll talk about this. Yeah. So interestingly, even when you look at the Indian archive, you're going to find a huge debate about cholera. All right. I mean, I remember when I was searching for something else, but when you're in an archive, you normally hit upon many other things. And I was extremely surprised when I was looking at, when I was trying to search for material about the formation of colonial bodies in 19th century India, and I was looking at certain cultural tracks also, archaeological tracks also. I was constantly encountering health, all right? The problem of health, the policy of health, reports on health, the reports on urban space. In fact, if I clearly remember, there were close to, I might have discovered around 40 reports on cholera between 1817 and 1878. All of them centered around the presidencies, whether it was Madras presidency, Bombay presidency, and the Bengal presidency. That's all between 1870 and the 1890s. And there was a reason for it. In the sense, what happened, and if you're looking at this history of cholera, what happened is by 1830, by 1817, people are already talking about it. I mean, Fort St. George, there are reports within Fort St. George in Chennai that are already talking about cholera. And by 1830, though they have no idea what it is, remember, they have seriously no idea about what it is. But by 1830, you would find American news reports are entering in where they're talking about how cholera has made this massive progress across Russia. It has hit Germany, and by 1832, you're talking there. You already have press reports. June 6, 1832, you're talking about an infected ship that docked in Canada, and you're talking about how the entire disease moved across the eastern seaboard, and then the report is talking about how there was this pandemic between 1829 and 1849, and it killed millions worldwide. And 2 more pandemics followed, cholera pandemics followed. And the entire process is from between 1817 and 1830s until they actually find out what was the reason or why is cholera happening. But in the process of finding it out, they are going to set up something of what I can term as a rudimentary global health policy. Yeah. So what it does is cholera would disrupt this entire Western medical establishment, and at the same time, you're talking about how within the US, you're having 12 of the 13 states, they are repealing and changing their medical licensing laws. They're making ways for alternative practices. For example, something like a Thomsonian herbalism, talking about domestic medicines entering, quackery coming in, right? So in a sense, they still have no idea. As I said, it's like we are experimenting with this particular coronavirus, where we have no idea as to which medicine is going to be absolutely effective, right? Whether they're going to take Ayurvedic, homeopathic, or allopathic, whatever it is. That's precisely what's happening at that time with this cholera epidemic across Europe and the Americas. And mainly because this was a disease that was not understood. For example, they understood yellow fever. They knew what was smallpox. By 1790s, they had an idea, but cholera was something that was not understood. And this is reflective. This is reflective within the larger social condition of colonialism. In the sense, this entire problem of epidemics, this entire problem of pestilence, this entire idea of disease is going to organize your entire notion of spaces. For example, the city spaces. You're going to have the black town, the white town. You have this idea of an isolated colonial bungalow, all right? All not only to keep up this political idea of difference, right? Something like what Thomas Metcalfe talks about, the ideologies of the Raj. He's talking about this idea of difference that's happening, but at the same time, it's also to keep the pestilence out. It's also to keep disease out, all right? So this entire notion of isolation or this idea of quarantine was not just a racial idea, all right? It also involved this idea of keeping the pathogens out, yeah? I can't talk more about this right now, but what we do understand is they discovered what was a problem with cholera, and this happened in 1854. And interestingly, it happened through this entire process of mapping. So what happens is, 1854 London, a man called John Snow, he starts mapping cholera, and there's no idea as to what is the source of cholera, but what he does is he started contact tracing, what we understand as today's contact tracing. It begins contact tracing within the map of London, and he's plotting the spread of the disease across various localities. And he finds out that there's this massive concentration that's happening across one particular water pump that's on Broad Street. Yeah. So, and what the municipality does there is to shut off that water pump, and in the process, they're able to control the cholera pandemic. They have no cure for it, but they realize that it might be infected water that's leading to it, because all your older reports on cholera would talk about it in terms of it's airborne, it's meteorological, all right? So it's something that happens with seasons, it's like flu and so on and so forth. They clearly had no idea it's contaminated water. Yeah. Now it's this notion, and remember this, the idea in the two diseases, cholera and malaria, in India and across the Middle East, right? It created panic. 90% of your travel accounts, 90% of your health reports, 90% of your education reports are all talking about the problems of these two diseases within India, right? And it is not just here. You'll find this fascination for this epidemic happening within the American Gothic as well as the French Gothic, right? The American Gothic with a story called The Mask of Red Death, a fantasy by Edgar Allan Poe, and The Wandering Jew. A moment, please. Yeah. And the Wandering Jew by Eugene Sue. All right. Both these stories are talking about the spread of cholera. I don't have time to talk about these two novels, but enough to tell you this: that there was this idea of disease, this idea of dread. What I outlined with the uncanny, with the idea of the abject, and so on and so forth, is absolutely mirrored here. But what's absolutely mirrored here is also the idea that there might be something that is very Orientalistic, something that's very Asiatic, in the sense, let me put it in a very plain way, in the sense, British accounts of the period, even the Indian cholera accounts of the period would like to distinguish cholera from normal diarrhea, right? So there was an entire term that was put in, something called Asiatic diarrhea, right? So I mean, there's this political idea behind it, and so on and so forth. Yeah, of differentiating something that would happen, something disgusting that would happen within the colonies, and is affecting the larger civilized spaces. Very Orientalistic. I won't spend too much on the Wandering Jew and this thing. What I will end with this talk with is what we need to understand, whether it's Gothic writing or whether it's a catastrophe and so on and so forth. If you're going to look at the history of disease and the history of mapping the disease, there are a few points that you could look at. One is this entire idea of geographical mapping and cartography, right? Which are the malaria areas, which are the choleric areas, which are the areas where leprosy was there, and so on and so forth. So they would be mapping the cartographical mapping of areas. You would have spaces and spacing. You're going to talk about personal spacing, you want to talk about gender spacing, you want to talk about class spacing, you want to talk about spacing due to disease. This entire growth of sanatoriums and so on and so forth that happened in Europe is largely because of this. So this entire notion of space and spacing, the idea of ghettoization, the idea of travel restrictions, the idea of commerce, the nature of racial stereotypes, the pandemic dread and the associated Gothic imagination is something that you need to look at. At the same time, remember, disease was absolutely responsible for the growth of capitalism and commerce, right? It inhibited it also. It is also a part of the larger growth and the circulation of capital, because disease has its own capital. So it is also a way of reimagining globality. And that's precisely what we need to do today. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Dr. Balaji. That was very, very insightful, very deep indeed. A very interesting historical perspective that you have given here. Thanks a lot, sir. Thanks a lot.
Most welcome. Yeah. Most welcome, sir.
Yeah. The second plenary speaker is Dr. Sachin Ketkar from MS University of Baroda. I would request Dr. Sachin to come, put on your mic and video. Yes.
Yeah, hello. Good afternoon, all of you. Can you hear me clearly?
Yeah, we can listen. Are you going to make a presentation or orally you are going to talk?
No, I'm going to make a presentation, so I will be sharing the screen just now.
Okay, okay.
So first of all, I want to thank all of you, especially Professor Dilip Bharat, for giving me an opportunity to share my research with all of you, and also the Department of English at Bhavnagar University for having me with you. So, I want to congratulate Professor Dilip Bharat for organizing such a relevant topic, means topic that now that coronavirus has disrupted all of our life, our academics will also be no longer the same. So keeping this contemporary relevance in mind, I think you're done a great job in having this seminar. So I want to congratulate you and go straight away to my topic. My topic is globalization gone viral, reading contagion metaphors in contemporary Marathi poetry. And what I want to do is I'm trying to develop a critical framework for historical analysis of poetics and politics of contagion pandemic and literature, and thereby familiarize researchers to the way of theoretically reading tropes of contagion in contemporary literature in their historical context. So by the end of the presentation, I think, I hope that you will get a sense of what globalization is and how writers have engaged with it. You'll also get a sense of how major intellectuals and writers have engaged with the question of contagion, epidemic and pandemics in their writing, and how can we go about trying to make a sense of representation of contagion, pandemic, and epidemic in literary and cultural text. So this is a broad kind of objective with which I'm trying to make this presentation. And given the time limit, I'm going to be very specific. So this is how I plan to develop this conversation further. First, I will talk about globalization and what do we even mean when we say globalization and how has it gone viral. I will also talk about, very briefly, contemporary Marathi poetry. I will also talk about the metaphors and tropes of contagion and epidemic in contemporary Marathi poetry. And I will also then go on to reflect about some of the theorization, conceptualization of epidemic and contagion metaphors, especially one very influential one done by Susan Sontag called Illness as Metaphor. And I will then also try to look at biopolitics, a kind of, and the notion of governmentality that Michel Foucault developed towards the end of his life, and how we can bring about these larger intellectual philosophizing to bear on reading contemporary literature, especially the pandemic literature, if you want to use that word, though I'm hesitant. So if we can think about having poetics and global biopolitics of contagion literature. So if we look at the term globalization, then many people have said many things about it, and it's kind of umbrella term. And I usually find theorization given by Anthony Giddens to describe the post-1989 world whose everyday life is transformed by worldwide communication revolution, driven by satellite communication, the internet, and the smartphones today. It also implies globalist marketplace marked by the massive influence of financial markets and emergence of weightless economy that throws up a new range of risk situation and questions of ecology. This is how Anthony Giddens has attempted, and the noted sociologist attempted to define globalization. There are various ways of theorizing it, though I have relied on this. New risk situations do not include only cross-border terrorism, rapid advancement in artificial intelligence, global warming, climate change, but also outbreaks of global pandemic as we are experiencing it today. Giddens sees globalization as not as post-modernity or as an end of modernity, but intensification of modernity, and also as something that is a consequence of modernity. So globalization has to be understood today as an umbrella term for multiple chaotic process rather than a singular phenomena. And contemporary Marathi poetry, especially after 90s, has engaged with this crisis of globalized modernity very, very intensely. The avant-garde poetry that developed, that came to front during the 90s, saw a kind of spectacular shift in sensibility, linguistic orientation, styles, themes, and techniques. And this shift was correlated with multiple social economic processes of globalization, and liberalization unleashed upon Indian society at that time. The diversity of social and cultural locations and ambitious encounter with these processes have shaped the poetics, politics, and the praxis of emergent poetry, which has often been termed in Marathi as Navadottar or post-90s poetry. And the emergent poets are poets like Salil Wagh, Mangesh Narayan Rao Kale, Sanjeev Khandekar, Manya Joshi, Hemant Divte, Mohan Borse, Sachin Ketkar, Varjesh Solanki, as well as radical Dalit and feminist poets like Bhujang Mishra, Marun Kale, Malika Amar Sheikh, Prajna Pawar, Kavita Mahajan, and so on. And a sampler of this is what I have translated and put together in my book called Live Update, an anthology of recent Marathi poetry. You may also find many of these translations online. What I'm going to do is I'm going to read out this poem. So I think that will give you a sense of how contemporary Marathi poetry engages with this multiplicity of dimensions of globalization. So here is the first poem. We are introducing a new concept in the market, and the poem is written by Marathi poet Mohan Borse, whose poem I have translated. And this is how the poem goes. We are introducing a new concept in the market. Doctor, I have an unmanageable itch. I have red abrasions due to incessant scratching. I don't know what epidemic is this. Everyone is scratching their head, back, hands, feet, loins. Shopping centers are overflowing with medicines. The newspapers are abound with advertisements of government schemes. This poem was written around 13 years ago, but you can see how relevant it is today. The atmosphere is smoggy. I can't see the person besides us. All the flats are closing their doors, doctor. One can only hear the screaming from MTV. One can only hear the slogan, "Ye dil mange more, doctor." The news about starvation death is smothered in the corner of newspaper, like it does even today. No longer I feel ashamed of scratching my loins in the midst of a crowded street, doctor. So this is the first poem. Another very interesting poem is by Arun Kale, a very prominent Dalit poet. And this is how his poem goes. There are some special places, especially reserved for scratching. Arrogance turns into God. Places to scratch becomes pilgrimages. Horses darkening the nationalist pride with venom of hatred for other castes and religion are let loose upon us. Only the sun, however, is the number one who alone can stop contagion from spreading. And when I read this line, I was reminded of a kind of belief that with the rise of temperature, coronavirus would slow down. That was one of the beliefs that we heard on TV. But here the metaphor of sun is more for the knowledge and enlightenment. That is a very prominent symbol in Dalit poetry. Stubborn peasants in their scratch garden refuse to grow thorny hedges. As one can't bury one's finger deep into blood-soiled earth, they take extreme care to spread of infection, to cure the itch. The third poem that I'm just going to read out is a poem called Faith by Manoj Pathak. And this is a very short poem called Shraddha. Pervading everything that exists, faith remains and spreads like AIDS, covering up the soles of my whole. Laughing shamelessly, I turn to face you, my Lord. And here is a short excerpt, the last poem, from a poem called Who Typed the Password to Restart by Hemant Divte. And it's a long poem. I'm just selecting a small extracts of it. And this is how it reads. At any given time, life runs out of insurance. At any given time, the internet goes down or we disconnect ourselves from the world. The massive program to self-destruct hangs in our brain. And even with every intention of deleting thought, the brain keeps being rattled by one persistent thought. We try to empty and quick double click an already overcrowded symmetry of the recycle bin. The thoughts buzz around in box, bouncing off its surfaces, suffering within. We have no means to escape from trafficked thoughts, spawning like viruses, duplicating, triplicating, multiplicating, 1,000 copies of a single thought, scattered and spread all over the disheveled mind. So if you look at these 4 poems, these poems engage with 4 dimensions of globalization, and all of them were written maybe 15, 20 years ago, in the gap of 15, 20 years ago. And Mohan Borse's poem deals with the commercialization and globalization of market and neoliberal economy, and how that is actually controlling the media. While the poem by Arun Kale talks about rise of communalism and religious fundamentalism and casteism, how it is connected to the growth of the globalized world. And Arun Kale's poem also talks about caste and a metaphor of sun as rationality, and sun also stands for Dr. Ambedkar's philosophy, how that can counter this terrible epidemic of communal hatred. While the third poem was by Manoj Pathak, and it talks about crisis of religious faith, and what do we mean by religion, and how faith is understood as contagion or an epidemic in the globalized world, and how individuals struggles to understand what God is or what religion is. While Hemant Divde's poem talks about the cyberspace and how it has engulfed people, and how it becomes a kind of obsessive preoccupation, and how human beings can't escape this cyberspace. So you can see these 4 poems talk about the metaphor of disease and epidemic to describe various aspects of globalization. So having taken a look at some of the texts, I think let's take a look at some of the theorizations around the idea of pandemic or contagion or viral infection. And very influential critical intervention in reading epidemic literature, if there is anything like that, comes from Susan Sontag's illness as metaphor and AIDS and its metaphor. Susan Sontag is arguing that illness is not a metaphor, and the most truthful way of regarding illness as the healthiest way of being is the most purified and most resistant to metaphorical thinking. What she is trying to point out that we give certain cultural meaning to illnesses, and these cultural meanings very often become oppressive and discriminating, and it discriminates people who are suffering from these diseases. And the only way out is to challenge this metaphorical thinking about various diseases. And she looks at the metaphors and mythological meanings associated with TB and cancer in Western art and literature. And we are all aware of how we use the word cancer in our everyday language. So metaphorical language, according to Susan Sontag, can stigmatize the ill person. Also look at and she also goes on to look at military metaphors that we use, like we use the word like corona warriors or war against corona, as if there are 2 sides. On one side you have something which is invisible, and there is on the other side human beings, as if nature is bifurcated into 2. So this kind of militaristic metaphors very often seem to target the bodies of the people suffering. In her very famous second book called AIDS and its Metaphors, she looks at metaphorical descriptions of plague, syphilis, venereal diseases, which involve stigmatizing and shaming the victim, and also examines how such diseases and media-generated imagery splits the disease from its photographic representation. In today's context, it would be television and social media representation, and how these metaphors resonate with the religious imagery of apocalypse, which is a very deeply Judeo-Christian belief, which informs all these metaphors of contagion that you find in Western culture or Hollywood. So we have to take on the board this kind of religious, archetypal, symbolic connotations of zombie apocalypse or whatever. Another very interesting book is by Jennifer Cook. In her book, Legacies of Plague in Literature, Theory and Film, she has shown how a normal body implies a healthy body, while plague-sickened bodies, society or texts involving thinking of metaphorical attachments, they are grafted within it or upon it. The embodiment of plague are varied. They include, for example, zombies, dictatorships, negative portrayal of Jews, and so on and so forth. And plague is also a kind of language effect and structure of thinking. So these are some of the important ways in which the metaphors of contagion and epidemics or pandemics are read in today's time. Another theoretical move, and which is very important for us when we come to think of epidemics and pandemics or viral infection, comes from very influential idea of governmentality and biopower, which French philosopher Michel Foucault developed in his later writings and his later lectures, to be more specific. And what Foucault is talking about is how does power get modernized? What are the processes by which power has been modernized in the Western civilization? And he says that during the earlier, before 16th and 17th century, sovereign or the king was the center of power, and he had the power over death, over people. However, 17th and 18th century onwards, with the rise of liberal thought, with the rise of bourgeois modernist new idea of state emerging, there is something called governmentality, where the whole question of power shifts to the question of how to govern a population of a particular region. And it may involve very often training people to govern themselves, just like government is trying to teach us to govern ourselves by using mask or social distancing or by hygiene or whatever. So its governmentality is also about how we govern ourselves. So the nature of power has shifted from 17th century onwards. And he gives an example of murderer. That murderer before 17th century would be punished for his crimes, while murderer after 17th century would become a kind of subject of research or a disciplinary power. A criminal would not only be punished, but also studied from various points of view of various disciplines, like psychology, economics, eugenics, and so on. And various kind of surveillance system, rehabilitative practices, and examination would be used to control him, to produce him as a subject of knowledge. So it also often, we think of surveillance system, and we think of various kind of apps they were developed by the government to keep a track of how, or we talk of how artificial intelligence can be used to track the corona super spreaders, as the term is used in the media these days. What I'm trying to argue that under, if we are to use this idea of governmentality and biopower, shifting of power from sovereign to the notion to the bio or the life of everyday life of population, then we have to modify this whole theoretical notion. We have to keep in mind that Foucault's formulation was before 1984, and he died to a global disease of AIDS, as many of us would be aware of. And globalization became an explosive development later on. So governmentality and biopower are the issues which are now on a global scale rather than a kind of nation-state region that Foucault is talking about. So we are as constantly being bombarded with statistics about testing and flattening the curve. We hear all the time about governing ourselves and so on. So looking at these two theoretical formulation, if you go back to where we started from, and if you look at the first poem, we are introducing a new concept in the market. We find that the epidemic of itching becomes a symbol for neoliberal ideology of globalization that sees market as solution to all problems. And its takeover of contemporary media, which marginalize and underplays the terrible consequences of capitalism, like starvation, like death, and so on. This neoliberal infection has made the narrator shameless enough to scratch anywhere. If you look at Arun Kale's poem, the epidemic stands for racist, nationalist, communal, and caste hatred born out of ignorance, which the son of enlightenment rationality, which is a key symbol in Dalit poetry, alone can control. So when we talk of modernity, we also talk of enlightenment rationality. And very often enlightenment rationality is associated with capitalist bourgeoisie, but in a very different kind of social cultural structure as in India, it can become a tool for emancipation as well. So people have stake in this rationalist idea of enlightenment. The crisis of religious faith, which is another aspect of globalization, is what the metaphor in Manoj Pathak's poem talks about. Hemant Dute's poem talks about the obsessive thoughts and feelings of being trapped in the globalized digital cyberspace are compared with the virus. And virus which is both natural as well as artificial in the sense of cyber virus, they spread rapidly out of anybody's control. Thus, the metaphors for pandemic in these poems are not used to stigmatize the shame or body of ill person, but they are used to criticize the globalized, governmentalized space, which is the space of statistics and which is the space of population. So with this, I want to actually come to end of what I'm discussing. What I'm trying to do is trying to understand how to historicize various tropes, various metaphors that we find in literary texts, and how to understand these texts in the context of various theoretical formulations, like one by Susan Sontag and by Michel Foucault's theorization of biopower and governmentality. So one observation that I want to leave you with is that though Susan Sontag talks about how you are discriminating against the body of the person who is infected with the disease, we find that this metaphor is used not to stigmatize the body of the user, but it's used to criticize the neoliberal government, the space of governmentality, our transnational space of governmentality. So this is where I want to stop. I will be very happy to take questions and suggestions and comments from all of you. And I again want to thank my friend Dilip Bharat for being kind enough to share my research here. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Sachin Ketkar. It was really indeed great to see everything in context of Marathi poetry. Thanks a lot for your insightful presentation and thoughts. It obviously will help many new research scholars to get some way to do their research also. Thanks a lot, sir. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, we invite the third speaker, Dr. Valiur Rahaman, to make a presentation.
Sure.
Dr. Valiur Rahaman. Yes, sir. Yeah.
So am I audible?
Yes, sir. You are audible,
Okay.
sir. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very
And
much.
are you going to make a presentation or
No,
orally?
it's oral talk. It's oral talk. It's a speech.
That's fine.
Okay,
That's
fine.
fine. Okay, sir.
And
Please go
it is comfortable because some kind of spontaneity is there in the thoughts, and it's
yeah, that's true. That's,
formulations. Right.
please.
So I am Valiur Rahaman. Let me introduce myself. I am Valiur Rahaman from Madhav Institute of Technology and Science, Gwalior, MP, India. First of all, I would like to thank Bhavnagar University, who has invited me to have a talk on this occasion, and especially Professor Dilip Bharat, who gave me this opportunity to submit my thoughts on epidemic and literature, and how COVID-19 be prevented by reading literature. This is one of the aims of my presentation. Would like to read now my paper, and this is for the students, the new comers, or the people who are trying to understand how theory or literary theory can be applied on literature in terms of medical sciences. The aim of this presentation is to evaluate literary art in terms of medical humanities in general and epidemic or pandemic in particular. The study explores a novel concept, what I call advanced humanities, of which medical humanities remains its integral branch of knowledge that offers the researchers and scholars an opportunity to witness humanities beyond its traditional premises and circumferences of studies. Literature, being a sub-branch of humanities, has gone far across its functions and become the source of knowledge system for the world of natural sciences and technology, nursing and medical sciences. In the Harvard classic prefaces and prologues to famous books, which I was reading last night deeply, Charles W. Eliot compiled viewpoints of literary artists about their works to be published, ranging from William Caxton to H.A. Taine. And I study these prefaces very deeply. Why? To observe how they are concerned, those authors were concerned about every aspect of past, present, and future of human lives, be it science, logic, government, policies, law, philosophies, psychology, habits of mind, astrology, anthropology, and what not. Perhaps it was the reason why Jacques Derrida defined literature as everything. Aristotelian theory of rhetoric is still foundation for all the models of communication in electronics. Descartes, the philosopher and literary artist, developed a principle called Cartesian oval, which is an integral part of geometry. Thomas Carlyle, a literary artist, developed what is known in mathematics as Carlyle circle. Bacon's preface to Novum Organum still works as epistemic shadow of what we know as critical pedagogy or democratic education or clinical psychology. Is worth quoting here when he writes in terms of responses he may receive after the publication of Novum Organum. He says, if anyone would form an opinion or judgment either out of his own behavior, out of his own observation, or out of the crowd of authorities, or out of the forms of demonstration concerning these speculation of mine, let him not hope that he can do it in passage or by the by. But let him examine the thing. This is a very important line that I am emphasizing here. But let him examine the thing truly. And it's actually we do it in literature or literary study. He says, but let him examine things truly. Let him make some little trial for himself of the way which I describe and lay out. Let him familiarize his thoughts with that subtlety of nature to which experience bears witness. Let him correct by reasonable, seasonable presence and due delay the depraved and deep-rooted habits of his mind. When all this is done and he has begun to be his own master, let him use his own judgment. So see, this kind of freedom is being given to literary studies, right? There is no counter reaction against the judgment if you made on anyone's speech or anyone's literary art. In the series of this point of view, I would like to give some kind of analysis of this small passage, and somewhere will conceptualize the major idea or major theory which I wanted to present before you. The words in the above paragraph, the words like observation, demonstration, speculations, familiarize, experience, and judgment are used for cognitive and neurological development of a person, which is possible, really possible, when a reader reads Novum Organum. This uniqueness of literature is observed in Shakespeare's work by Dr. Johnson also, who writes, the Pythagorean scale of numbers was at once discovered to be perfect. But the poems of Homer we yet know not to transcend the common limits of human intelligence. By remarking that nation after nation, century after century, has been able to do little more than transpose his incidents, new name his characters, and paraphrase his sentiments, unquote. It's a unique penetrating quality, means the unique penetrating qualities of literature are also worded by what Whitman in preface to Leaves of Grass, where he says, I quote, his brain, means the author's brain, means literary writer's brain, literary artist's brain, is the ultimate brain. The greatest poet hardly knows pettiness and trivialities. He is a seer. Past and present and future are not disjoined for him, but joined. He says further, he says that the artist speaks to the past. How? Commanding, rise and walk before me, and that I may realize you. Further, he distinctively writes, the sailor and traveler, the anatomist, chemist, astronomer, geologist, phrenologist, spiritualist, mathematicians, historian, lexicographer are not poets, but they are the lawgivers of poets, and their construction underlies the structure of every perfect poet. The above quoted words evaluate the depth of literary arts and witness delimitation of the subject matters for literary arts. Now let us turn toward the subject of today's talk, of course not without creative implications of the above illustrations I have made before. That is, the talk is about the literature and medical science. Say, literature for medical science can also be said. One of the best examples of that I have opted and studied is John Keats, who was the sufferer from an epidemic in 18th century or in the beginning of 19th century. known as tuberculosis, TB, a disease caused by bacteria that are spread through the air from person to person. If not treated properly, TB disease could be fatal. And of this only, Keats died in 1820. He was suffering from pulmonary tuberculosis, and at the age of 25, he died. Why I am quoting Keats, because further I will say or explain how in his compositions there is a kind of poetics of health, right? And in most of the poems, since he was also a practitioner of medical science, we must be knowing, and most of you must be might have some notions about this mystery, that he was also a medical practitioner. Somewhere he's practiced. So I would like to have some observations of Keatsian poetry. Right, Keats himself united the worlds of medicine and poetry in his unfinished epic poem, The Fall of Hyperion, in which he describes the poet as the physician. I quote, "Sure not all those melodies sung into the world's ear are useless. So a poet is a sage, a humanist, physician to all men," I unquote. The 6 years that Keats spent studying medicine, first as an apprentice to Dr. Hammond of Edmonton, and later as a medical student at Guy Hospital, London, inevitably affected his writings and influenced his life. This book examines the impact of Keats's medical training on his poetry and letters. Moreover, in providing details of Keats's studies, separate chapters are devoted to chemistry, botany, anatomy, and physiology, with descriptions of the lecture attended and of the faculty and glimpses of student life. The book gives an idea of the life of a medical student at that time. Most of his poems carry out the imageries of medical symptomatology. This is one of the important aspects of this analysis. Okay, I tried my level best to reach the imageries of medical symptomatology of TB in his poetry, with which the Ode to Nightingale begins. And everybody knows this line, verse line, my heart aches, and a drowsy numbness pain my sin, unquote. How one wants to ask, can aching and pain, such acute sensations, be occasioned by their ostensible opposite, a drowsy numbness, within quote, a drowsy numbness? The seemingly conflicting set of features is, it is clear, common to a variety of diseases like smallpox, tetanus, hydrophobia, epilepsy, as they were understood in the early 19th century as not less than epidemic. Because of there was no cure at all. Even TB, the word was not coined when John Keats was suffering from acute TB. And the investigation of the bacteria was done after 100 years. After 100 years, you will say, or 60 years after the death of John Keats. Not just symptom, let us see, not just symptom are emphasized at the beginning of the Nightingale Ode, however, but also that they act on the sense. The words are not explained only generally, they are acting at our senses. When we try to evaluate, when we try to read, it seems that the pain is really empathized or sympathized or perceived by the reader. Yet paradoxically, as the poem continues, the poet's sensation is weakened. And this is one of the symptoms of the person who used to suffer from TB, and it has been clarified. I will come to the point how 4 BC ago means in the works of some kind of Greek and Latin writers, how epidemics have been defined or taken into the consideration of writing. So see, passively drawn, if you see that he exclaims at the beginning of the stanza 5, let us take example. He explains at the beginning of stanza 5, whereat he finds himself relying solely on hearing and smell to orient himself. Passively drawn further out of the sensate world into the embalmed darkness. His volition likewise appears compromised. The Nightingale's plaintive anthem within quote, this is a very phrase or phrase. The Nightingale's plaintive anthem itself diminishes until it is suspended within quote, buried deep in the next valley glades, unquote. The art that offers the poet such vital intensity has led instead paradoxically toward the oblivion that threatened him as the ode began and that he has sought to escape. The word is very important, escape. I will come later. To escape, stanza by stanza, as it progresses. At the same time, the seeming pinnacle of ecstasy reached before the poem begins is increasingly overshadowed by a perpetuity of headache. This is one of the conceptual examples of what I establish here in my talk as the poetics of health embedded in the composition of John Keats. This symptomatology of TB is poetic composition, and it should be recorded that it is only a verse composition, yet it reflects the symptomatology of some epidemic or pandemic. Okay, TB was also once it was a pandemic. Okay, it ran across the world and millions of people would die once. So this symptomatology of TB in poetic composition of Keats was exposed 60 years before a German physician and Nobel laureate Dr. Robert Koch announced the discovery of Mycobacterium tuberculosis, the bacteria that causes tuberculosis, in March 1882. During this time, TB killed 1 out of every 7 people living in the United States and Europe, it is recorded. Dr. Koch's discovery was the most important step taken toward the control and elimination of this deadly disease. Based on his findings and achievements, a century later, March 24 was diagnosed, and still it is was diagnosed as World TB Day, a day to educate the public about the impact of TB around the world. Whose contribution was? The contribution was similarly contribution was of a literary artist. Keats's medical imagery recalls almost all the symptoms what Hippocrates, about whom I was talking a bit, had. The philosopher, historian, physician had once written in of the epidemics. This is one of the important treatises in the medical sciences. And remember, Hippocrates was not a physician. He was a historian, philosopher, and an artist. 400 BC. Hippocrates called the TB symptoms the symptoms of phthisis. Phthisis, P-H-T-H-I-S-I-S. Phthisis, which literally means things that cause decay or wasting away, known as an epidemic. I take epidemic and pandemic in this sense only. It wastes away. Related to lungs, then it was related to the lung diseases in his time. The symptomatology of phthisis is early. He says early. It happens in the evening, in the beginning of spring, and through the summer and towards winter. Many of those who had been long gradually declining took to bed with symptom of phthisis. Many, and in fact, most of them died. Phthisis makes its attacks chiefly between the age of 18 and 35, and everybody knows Keats died in a very early stage of life. Pains about the head, he continues, I quote, pains about the head and neck, heaviness of the same, along with pain, occur either without fevers or in fevers. Convulsions occurring in persons attacked with frenzy and having vomiting off were digris green. Everybody knows about this word. A green patina formed on copper, brass, or bronze surfaces produced for a long period of time if you leave that plate there. So in some cases, quickly prove fatal. In ardent, I quote, in ardent, he says, in ardent fevers and in those other fevers in which there is pain of the neck, heaviness of the temples, mistice about the eyes, and distension about the hypochondriac region, not unattended with pain, hemorrhage, from the nose takes place, but those who have heaviness of the whole head, cardialgia, nausea, and women have those also pains in the uterus, whereas in elder persons, those in whom the heat is already more subdued, these cases end in paralysis, mania, and loss of sight. These are the symptoms that are contained in the poetry of, in the words or in the imageries of Keatsian composition, especially Nightingale and Hyperion. Most of them are found in Keatsian compositions. In this direction, Donald Galnis has studied the poet physician, and he wrote the book Poet Physician in the study of Keatsian, how Keatsian poetry is related to the medical science, and how does composition of Keats contribute to develop new things, innovative artistry in medical science to cure epidemics too. This analysis was one of the examples. This evaluation was one of the examples of what I call the poetics of health, explained with special references to the poems of John Keats. Further, I would like to come on the fictions and who has done something rare, something strange, and justify the statement of what Whitman once he said, that poets are seers. Poet sees, and it was done by Mary Shelley, who comes first in the history of English literary arts, who foretold about a future pandemic in which we are today, to be occurred at the end of 21st century. And we are living in 21st century, and we should take notice that this foretelling was done by Mary Shelley. I recall here the words of what Whitman, I have already told you, poet is here, and this metaphoric statement, this metaphoric verse statement was somewhere exemplified by the works of Mary Shelley in her Last Man, the novel, which attempts to understand the scope of scientific inquiry in devastating apocalypse, strongly suggesting that medicine had become too timid and ultimately come too late. In its introduction, Mary Shelley states that she discovered in the Sibyl's cave near Naples a collection of prophetic writings painted on leaves by the Cumean Sibyl. She has edited these writings into the current narrative, the first person narrative of a man living at the end of the 21st century, commencing in 2073 and concluding in 2000 C. Despite the chronological setting, the world of the Last Man appears to be relatively similar to the era in which it was written. The next example is Edgar Allan Poe's The Mask of the Red Death. Short story by Edgar Allan Poe, but it follows Prince Prospero's attempts to avoid a dangerous, important line, avoid a dangerous plague. I said to you, escapism, the word escape was also important. Here, similar word is used by me to avoid a dangerous plague, known as the Red Death, by hiding in his abbey. Everybody is doing these days. I will be coming at the end. He, along with many other wealthy nobles, hosts a masquerade ball within 7 rooms of the abbey. Each decorates with different color. In the midst of their rivalry, a mysterious figure disguised as Red Death victim enters and makes his way through each of the rooms. Prospero dies after confronting this stranger whose costume proves to contain nothing tangible inside it. The guests also die in turn. Pandemic fear, another example, pandemic fear and literature is observed in Jack London's The Scarlet Plague. Though Jack London had been proved and justified by the court that he is a pleasureist, the greatest pleasureist. But the way he has maintained the plots and interrelated the stories or the small kinds of incidents is really a matter of appreciation, and we don't find it in the Scarlet Plague. This is a post-apocalyptic fiction published in 1912. The book was noted in 2020 as having been prescient of the coronavirus outbreak, especially given he wrote it at a time when the world was not as quickly connected by travel as it is today. Smith is another person who, one of the characters of that Scarlet Plague, who have played important role to depict how hiding and escapism can concludes nothing but disastrous and decaying conditions. What common things I observed in my study, and that is what the point I wanted to just put forth or submit before you all, that all these creative specimens are human fear of contagion conditions, escapism from a fatal life in death, right conditions, and foretelling of the literary artist. All these are the characteristic features of such kind of literature, and the stories are webbed in these kinds of imageries. Okay, hence we can apply poetics of health as an approach to literature. We have to demonstrate these observations in comparison to the works like Boccaccio's The Decameron, Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales, which portrays the fear of contagion, increased vices such as avarice, greed, and corruption, which paradoxically led to infection, thus to both moral and physical death. A Journey of the Plague Year by Daniel Defoe is their historical narratives of what has happened once in the world out of a great plague in London in 1665. Of course, unforgettable Christiana Rossity's The Plague poem. Camus' The Plague is Stephen King's The Stand, which is a post-apocalyptic, again, dark fantasy fiction in 1978. Its plot centers on a pandemic of a weaponized strain of influenza that kills almost the entire world population. And this is what the difference, as Professor Chattopadhyay has made a clear distinction between what epidemic and pandemic is. I'm thankful to him to clarify the notion. The few survivors united in groups establish a new social system and engage in confrontation with each other. After reading literature, my message at end is, after reading literature in terms of epidemic or pandemic terms, medical conditions, societal unrest, public unawareness, and results of anti-quarantine escapism. This phrase is, it is very specific. Results of anti-quarantine escapism, breaking lockdown laws made under COVID-19 pandemic, of which we, the human and post-human beings, are suffering, can at least lead us to its prevention and control. The entire history of literary arts related to epidemic and pandemic addresses how social irresponsibility of a person or a few persons bring disaster and decay at a few socially inspired at the same time, a few socially inspired or humanity inspired persons bring out new societies where the care of the self becomes the social care to prevent and control pandemic. Thanks. Thank you very much. Thanks once again for considering my submissions and giving time, patience that you people were having. I thank to Professor Bharat, Professor Atanu Bhattacharya, Kalyan Chattopadhyay, and all other plenary speakers available here. And I learned a lot of things. I'm really thankful. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Excellent, Dr. Valiur Rahaman. This was really indeed a very good one. Medical humanities, this is the area which normally is not explored a lot in the field of literature. So it's very interesting to see how medical humanities can also be explored. And the poetics of medicine also is something very interesting that you have talked about.
Poetics of health.
Poetics of health. And very interesting that this is a totally new dimension of doing a research also in this. Many have commented that this is something very new, unique, and first time they are listening this kind of talk about the politics of health.
All due to you, all due to you, all due to you, sir.
No, thanks. Your work is good. Thanks a lot, sir. Thanks a lot. Yeah. The announcement for the participants. Our next session is a paper presentation session, and which was scheduled to start at 4:30, but we will start 15 minutes earlier. So it is around about 4:15. We are going to start the second paper presentation session. So all the presenters, as per the schedule that is given to you, you should be ready by 4:15. The stream will cut down for 15 minutes, and you have to re-log in. So those who are going to read paper, you should be very quick to re-log in, and then we will start our last session of today, that is paper presentation. 15 participants are going to present the paper in that session. Thank you, all of you. Thank you.